Chapter 1. The Beginning. As the late afternoon crept toward evening, the sun sank low on the horizon, casting a blend of pink and purple hues across the sky in Chicopee, Massachusetts. The day went to night, the sun's warmth fading into the cool dusk air. Noah, the hotel's maintenance worker, stood in the lobby, wiping sweat from his brow as he finished replacing a stubborn, flickering light bulb. At 32, Noah was built for labor, his sturdy frame shaped by years of demanding hands-on work. His calloused hands, marked by cuts and scratches, told the story of a life spent fixing, building, and solving problems, skills that had shaped him into a reliable figure at the Hampton Inn. Though an introvert by nature, Noah's sharp eyes missed nothing, and his steady demeanor often gave comfort to those around him, even when things went wrong. "There," he said, stepping down from the ladder. "That should do it." Charlotte, the receptionist, looked up from her computer and flashed him a warm smile. "Thanks, Noah. You're a lifesaver." "Just doing my job," he replied with a modest shrug, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward. Noah appreciated Charlotte's genuine warmth. It was a stark contrast to the cold efficiency of some of the other staff members. Charlotte, 28, with her auburn hair catching the soft lobby light, carefully tucked a loose strand behind her ear as she turned her attention back to the guest before her. Her posture was poised, the product of countless hours standing behind a reception desk, exuding a calm professionalism that immediately put people at ease. Her warm and melodic voice was a finely tuned instrument, honed over years in the hospitality industry. Every word was measured to make even the most weary travelers feel at home. "Welcome to the Hampton Inn. How may I assist you today?" she asked, her tone effortlessly blending warmth with efficiency. Behind her polished demeanor, Charlotte's keen eyes assessed the guests, quickly determining what they might need, a skill sharpened from years of reading people. Though she often had to juggle 100 tasks at once, Charlotte never let the cracks show. Her ability to manage chaos gracefully made her an invaluable part of the hotel's operation. Noah admired her ability to make even the most frazzled traveler feel at ease. It was a busy day, with many guests arriving for a local business conference. As he wheeled his tool cart back to the maintenance room, he overheard snippets of conversation about meetings and presentations. The hotel's location on Memorial Drive, also called Route 33, was ideal for business travelers and tourists. Just across the street, the sprawling Walmart Supercenter and Marshalls offered convenient shopping options. Noah made a mental note to swing by Dick's Sporting Goods after his shift to pick up some new fishing gear for his upcoming weekend trip. As he organized his tools, Noah's mind wandered to the skills his father had taught him growing up in their small town. From basic carpentry to plumbing, those lessons had served him well in his role at the hotel. He took pride in keeping the place running smoothly, even if it meant dealing with the occasional demanding guest or clogged toilet. Meanwhile, Charlotte efficiently managed the flow of check-ins, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she assigned rooms and answered questions about local attractions. She recommended a nearby restaurant to a couple celebrating their anniversary, her eyes lighting up as she described the romantic ambiance. "You two remind me of my parents," she said warmly. "They just celebrated their 30th anniversary last month." The couple beamed at Charlotte, their smiles reflecting genuine appreciation for her warm, personal touch. She had a way of making every guest feel uniquely valued, and it was clear they had noticed. As they turned to head toward the elevator, chatting quietly with each other, Charlotte's gaze followed them for a moment before drifting toward the large windows framing the parking lot. Beyond the glass, the golden glow of the setting sun bathed everything in a soft, amber light. Outside, the late afternoon traffic along Memorial Drive, also known as Route 33, began to swell, a steady stream of cars carrying commuters home after a long day. The hum of engines and the distant blur of headlights created a backdrop of normalcy, a familiar rhythm of city life. Yet despite the routine scene, Charlotte couldn't shake the faint unease that tugged at her thoughts, a strange stillness in the air that felt out of place in the busy landscape. Suddenly, a cacophony of car horns and screeching tires erupted from outside. Charlotte frowned, leaning forward to get a better look. "That's odd," she murmured. Noah emerged from the maintenance room, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on out there?" Before Charlotte could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. Both rushed to the windows, their eyes widening in disbelief at the scene unfolding before them. On the street, chaos erupted in a way that seemed almost unreal. Cars swerved erratically, tires screeching as they veered out of control. Some collided violently with one another, the sound of crumpling metal and shattering glass cutting through the evening air. Smoke billowed from the wrecks, filling the already tense atmosphere with the stench of burning rubber. People flooded the sidewalks and streets, running in every direction, their faces twisted in terror, eyes wide with disbelief. Some screamed, others shouted desperately for loved ones, but most were silent, driven only by the primal instinct to flee. In the heart of this madness there were figures. People, or what once were people, moving with a grotesque, unnatural lurch. Their movements were jerky, limbs stiff as if barely under control. They staggered forward, hands outstretched, grabbing at the fleeing pedestrians with a chilling, relentless hunger. Panic surged through the crowd as these figures latched onto victims, pulling them down onto the ground. And then, amidst the confusion, Charlotte caught sight of something horrifying. Blood, thick and dark, streaking across the pavement, splattered on car windows, staining the hands and faces of the attackers. "What the hell?" Noah breathed, his normally calm demeanor shaken. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, are those people attacking each other?" As they stood frozen in horror, their eyes locked onto the scene unfolding across the street. A man staggered out of the Walmart parking lot, his once ordinary appearance now nightmarish. His clothes were torn apart and soaked in dark red blood, his clothing hanging from his body in ragged strips. His face was pale and twisted with a vacant, animalistic hunger, eyes fixed over and unseeing. He moved with a slow, jerky, and unnatural, his body swaying, limbs swinging as if they were barely held together. Without warning, he lurched toward a woman who had just stepped out of her car, unaware of the danger. She had barely closed the door when his hands latched onto her, gripping her arms with what looked like superhuman strength. Before she could even scream, he pulled her close and with a sickening motion sank his teeth deep into her neck. The sounds of her screams, the sight of tearing flesh, her neck muscle being pulled then snapping between his teeth, was followed by another agonized, blood-curdling scream that ripped through the air, echoing across the parking lot, making the hairs on the back of Noah's neck stand up. The woman's shriek of terror and pain seemed to hang in the air, piercing through the growing chaos as blood poured from the savage wound. "This can't be happening," Charlotte whispered, her face pale. Charlotte stood behind the front desk, her fingers gripping the edge as she tried to process the growing panic outside. In the background, the faint hum of the lobby television broke through her thoughts. The TV, mounted high on the wall in the corner, flickered with a news report that had been running on a loop for the last hour, its usual mundane updates replaced with a breaking news banner in bold red letters. The anchor, a woman with a stern face that barely masked her anxiety, spoke in a rapid, controlled tone. "We're receiving multiple reports of violent attacks occurring throughout the city. Witnesses describe individuals acting erratically, attacking pedestrians and motorists without warning. Authorities advise all citizens to stay indoors and lock all doors and windows immediately." Charlotte's heart raced as she listened to the anchor's words. The sense of calm in the hotel lobby was a stark contrast to the chaos beyond its walls. She glanced at the windows, the daylight quickly fading outside, and caught the reflection of people running frantically across the parking lot, some screaming, others banging on car doors, desperate to get inside. The anchor's sharp and clear voice cut through the distant noise. "This is not an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks of violence have been reported in neighboring cities. Law enforcement is stretched thin, and emergency services are overwhelmed. Once again, if you are watching this broadcast, stay inside. Do not engage with anyone. Lock all doors and windows, and wait for further instructions." Charlotte's gaze returned to the TV. The camera switched to grainy footage of streets in chaos, people running in terror, some pursued by figures whose jerky movements were all too familiar. The anchor's voice continued, now strained with urgency. "We urge you to remain calm. Authorities are working to control the situation. For your safety, do not leave your homes under any circumstances." A chill ran down Charlotte's spine as the anchor's voice faded slightly, drowned out by the distant sound of sirens growing louder outside. Noah's mind raced, struggling to piece together the nightmare unfolding before him. He stood frozen for a moment, his breath shallow, trying to make sense of the surreal scene. It was the chaos that didn't belong in the real world, something ripped straight from the most terrifying horror films he'd ever watched. For a fleeting second, his thoughts drifted to those late nights spent glued to the TV, watching flesh-eating zombies tear through unsuspecting towns. But this wasn't a movie. No screen separated him from the madness outside. The ridiculous thought of comparing this to fiction vanished as quickly as it appeared, overwhelmed by the raw, gut-wrenching realization that this was happening right now. Through the windows he could see people running wildly in every direction, some screaming, others silent with shock. Cars crashed into each other on Memorial Drive, horns blaring and tires screeching as drivers tried desperately to escape the gridlock. In the distance, he spotted figures, human-like but moving with an unnatural jerking gait, stalking through the chaos, grabbing at fleeing pedestrians. Noah's heart pounded in his chest. This was real. Whatever was happening, it was dangerous in ways he could hardly comprehend. He wasn't trained for this kind of thing, but years of fixing problems around the hotel taught him to stay calm under pressure and to act when everything seemed to be falling apart. His hands clenched into fists, still calloused from years of physical labor. He knew he had to stay focused. Whatever this was, it was a threat like nothing he had ever faced, and standing idle would only make him another victim. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to lock down the hotel, now." She nodded. "I'll make an announcement to the guests. What should I tell them?" Noah ran a hand through his short brown hair, thinking quickly. "Tell them there's been a security incident in the area. Ask everyone to remain in their rooms until further notice." Charlotte rushed toward the front desk, focusing on making the emergency announcement. Noah's gaze swept across the lobby, his thoughts racing. Every detail of the space he'd once known so well now appeared in a new, terrifying light. The large glass doors at the entrance, which had always given the hotel an inviting, open feel, suddenly seemed like gaping vulnerabilities. The panes of glass, so thin and fragile, stood no chance against the violent chaos outside. Even the thick, decorative pillars lining the lobby provided little comfort. They could obscure sight lines, but they offered no real defense. His eyes settled on the security gates at the entrance, heavy metal shutters that could be pulled down to seal off the lobby. They'd only been used for closing the hotel at night or during minor security drills. Still, now they were the only thing standing between the guests and the horrors outside. Noah knew the gates were durable, reinforced with steel bars, and designed to withstand physical force, but they weren't invincible. If enough of those things gathered or the panic from the streets spilled inside, they might not hold. Outside, the situation was spiraling out of control. Noah could see the chaos spreading like wildfire through the parking lot and beyond. People were running in blind terror from the direction of Chicopee City Hall, their faces pale with fear, their desperate screams piercing the thick glass windows. Cars screeched and swerved as drivers tried to escape the madness, but the streets were becoming choked with traffic and panicked pedestrians. The distant sound of sirens wailed through the evening air. Still, the noise seemed faint and ineffective, a feeble cry against the overwhelming violence sweeping through the streets. Noah clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the tool belt still slung around his waist. They had to lock down the hotel fast. Charlotte's voice came over the hotel's PA system, calm but firm. "Attention, guests of the Hampton Inn. Due to a security incident in the area, we kindly ask that you remain in your rooms until further notice. We will provide updates as soon as possible. Thank you for your cooperation." As soon as she finished, she turned to Noah, her professional mask slipping to reveal the fear underneath. "What do we do now?" Noah took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. "We need to secure the building. I'll start barricading the entrances." "Can you call the police?" Charlotte nodded, reaching for the phone. But as she dialed, her face fell. "The line's dead," she said, her voice trembling. Noah's stomach tightened. He pulled out his cell phone, but there was no signal. Whatever was happening, it was big enough to disrupt communications. A loud bang on the front doors made them both jump. A man covered in blood was pounding on the glass, his eyes wild and unfocused. Behind him, more figures were making their way across the parking lot, their movements spasmodic and twitchy. "Help me!" the man at the door screamed. "Please, let me in! Let me in, godmit! Don't let me die out here!" Noah and Charlotte exchanged a look of uncertainty. Their instincts told them to help, but the scene outside was too horrifying, too inexplicable. "We can't just leave him out there," Charlotte said, her compassion warring with her fear. Noah hesitated, torn between the desire to help and the need to protect those already inside. It was a moral dilemma he never thought he'd face. But as he watched more of those things approaching the hotel, he decided, "We can't risk it," he said grimly. "We don't know what's wrong with them. For all we know, he could be infected with whatever's causing this." Charlotte nodded reluctantly, tears welling as the man outside continued to plead. Noah placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "We need to focus on protecting the people inside. Can you start gathering supplies? We might need water, food, anything if we're stuck here for a while." Charlotte took a shaky breath, then nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Okay, I'll check our inventory and see what we have." As she hurried off, Noah turned back to the scene outside. The streets of Chicopee, once so familiar and mundane, had transformed into a nightmare landscape in a matter of minutes. He could see the chaos spreading towards other landmarks, the Big Y world-class market and the Chicopee marketplace, places he had visited countless times without a second thought. Now, those everyday locations were becoming battlegrounds in a war against an enemy he couldn't even begin to understand. Noah clenched his fists, determination setting in. He might not know what they were against, but he knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to keep Charlotte and the other guests safe. With a final glance at the terrifying scene outside, Noah turned and strode purposefully towards the maintenance room. It was time to turn this hotel into a fortress. His mind raced with plans and possibilities as he gathered tools and materials. The skills his father had taught him, once used for simple repairs, were about to be put to the ultimate test. Chapter 2. Lockdown at the Hampton Inn. The eerie silence that settled after the initial wave of chaos was almost more unsettling than the screams and sirens that had filled the air moments before. Noah stood at the front entrance of the Hampton Inn, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped a toolbox filled with supplies for fortification, heavy-duty nails, a hammer, a roll of steel wire, and planks of wood they had scavenged from the maintenance storage room. Beside him, Charlotte stood with her arms crossed, a crowbar in one hand, her usual warm and welcoming demeanor replaced by a look of grim resolve. Her eyes, ordinarily soft with hospitality, now scanned the lobby with the sharp focus of someone ready to fight for survival. Together, they prepared to barricade the vulnerable glass windows, working quickly and quietly. Every slight creak, every distant sound from the streets beyond, sent a jolt of tension through them both. Noah's mind raced as he tried to remember everything he knew about securing entrances. They couldn't leave anything to chance. The flimsy windows of the hotel lobby wouldn't hold forever without reinforcement. Charlotte knelt down, handing Noah a steel bracket as he secured the makeshift barricade. "We have to make sure nothing gets through," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with urgency. They worked in tandem, sealing off the entry points, knowing that this thin defense might be the only thing between them and the horrors closing in from the outside. "We need to secure this place, and fast," Noah said, his voice low and urgent. "Those things, they'll be coming for us soon." Charlotte nodded, her eyes scanning the lobby. "The guests, we need to keep them safe and calm. I'll handle that. You focus on barricading the entrances." As they sprang into action, the harsh reality of their situation hit like a sledgehammer. The world outside had descended into chaos in mere hours, a nightmare unfolding at a pace no one could have predicted. The streets that had once been filled with the sounds of everyday life were now consumed by screams, burning vehicles, and the sickening sight of blood and death in the streets. Now, within the walls of the Hampton Inn, Noah and Charlotte were the only line of defense standing between the terrified hotel guests and certain death. Noah moved with efficiency, which was created from years of practical labor. His mind focused on one thing: fortification. He scanned the lobby, taking stock of every item that could be repurposed. Desks, chairs, tables, anything with weight was quickly dragged toward the entrance. Even the heavy potted plants once used to add a touch of nature to the hotel's sleek design were hauled over and stacked like barricades against the glass doors. Each time Noah glanced at the doors, his stomach tightened. Once a symbol of openness and hospitality, the glass now appeared terrifyingly fragile. It was the only thing separating them from the madness outside. He could still see through it. Beyond the lobby, the parking lot was littered with abandoned cars. In the distance, shapes moved erratically, some running, others lurching with the unnatural gait of the infected. He couldn't tell how long the barricade would hold, but it had to buy them some time. Dripped down Noah's brow as he worked, muscles straining as he hefted the last of the heavy furniture into place. Charlotte was at his side, pulling tables and chairs from the lobby's cafe, her face tight with fear but focused. Together, they created a makeshift wall, stacking items higher and higher against the glass, trying to reinforce the entrance before whatever was coming reached them. The hotel guests huddled nearby, eyes wide with panic as they watched Noah and Charlotte work. Some whispered in frantic voices, clutching their phones as though waiting for a lifeline that would never come. Others stood in shocked silence, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. There was no going back. A regular afternoon in Chicopee had transformed into a fight for survival. "We need something sturdier," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. His mind raced, recalling the layout of the hotel. The maintenance room! As Noah hurried to retrieve more robust materials, Charlotte faced a different challenge. The lobby was filled with terrified guests, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. Some were crying, others arguing, and a few seemed shocked. Charlotte raised her voice, infusing it with a calm authority she didn't feel. "Everyone, please, I need your attention. We are implementing emergency protocols to ensure your safety. Please go back to your rooms and lock the doors." Her words had an immediate effect, cutting through the panic. The guests turned to her, desperate for guidance in this unthinkable situation. "What's happening out there?" a trembling woman asked, clutching her young daughter close. Charlotte took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "There's a dangerous situation unfolding in the city. We don't have all the details yet, but I assure you, we are taking every precaution to keep you safe here in the hotel." As she spoke, Noah returned, pushing a cart loaded with materials. He caught Charlotte's eye, giving her a nod of appreciation for handling the situation. Working together, they began to fortify the hotel systematically. Noah used heavy-duty brackets and screws to secure metal sheets over the windows. At the same time, Charlotte organized the guests who refused to return to their rooms into groups, assigning them tasks to help with the barricading process. "Remember," she instructed, her voice steady and reassuring, "we're stronger together. Working as a team increases our chances of getting through this." As the afternoon dragged into evening, the chaos outside escalated with terrifying speed. The familiar sounds of the city, car engines, idle chatter, and the hum of daily life, were replaced by the distant roar of panicked screams and the unsettling crash of metal and glass. From behind their makeshift barricades, Noah and Charlotte peered through narrow gaps, their breath caught in their throats as they watched the horror unfold beyond their fragile defenses. The nearby Walmart supercenter, typically a bustling hub of shoppers and families, had transformed into something out of a nightmare. What was once a place of mundane routine, groceries, household goods, the comforting hum of fluorescent lights, was now a scene of pure chaos and destruction. The vast parking lot, where rows of cars were usually lined up neatly, had become a war zone. Through the dimming light, they could see figures stumbling through the lot, their movements grotesquely unnatural, bodies jerking and twitching with horrifying randomness. People, if they could still be called that, wandered aimlessly or, worse, lurched with purpose toward anyone still trying to flee. Their pale and mottled skin hung loosely on their bones as though decaying from the inside. Faces that had once been human were twisted in a grotesque mix of vacant hunger and lifelessness, their eyes glazed over, staring through the world with a mechanical, unfeeling gaze. Nearby, a few survivors were overtaken, too slow or too confused to escape. The creatures swarmed them, and the sound of desperate, choked cries reached Noah and Charlotte even from the safety of the lobby. Walmart's front doors had been smashed open, leaving a gaping wound in the facade, allowing the infected to flow in and out like a swarm of locusts. Cars, abandoned by their drivers in panicked haste, were scattered throughout the parking lot, some with their doors flung wide open, others with windows shattered. In one corner, a minivan smoldered, its hood crushed and leaking smoke into the evening air. It was a stark reminder that what had started as panic had devolved into violence and destruction within hours. Noah glanced at Charlotte, their eyes wide with shared understanding. This wasn't just a passing crisis. This was the beginning of something far worse. Once a sign of safety and escape, the streets had become a death trap. Now they all stood between the terror outside and the fragile safety within the hotel. "My God," Noah whispered, peering out. "It's like something out of a nightmare." Charlotte joined him, her face paling at the sight. "We can't let them in, no matter what." Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. The moral dilemma they had faced earlier with the bloodied man was now a harsh reality they would have to live with. As night began to fall, casting long shadows across the fortified lobby, Noah and Charlotte gathered the guests for a meeting. The fear in the room was palpable, but there was also a growing sense of unity. "We've secured the building as best we can," Noah explained, his tone direct but not unkind. "But we need to talk about our supplies. We don't know how long this situation will last, so we need to be smart about what we have." Charlotte stepped forward, her hospitality training kicking in once more. "We'll be rationing food and water starting immediately. It's not ideal, I know, but it's necessary for our survival." There were murmurs of discontent, but no outright objections. The gravity of their situation was becoming clear to everyone. As the meeting concluded, Noah pulled Charlotte aside. "We need to do a full inventory," he said in a low voice, "and we should set up a watch rotation. I don't trust those barricades to hold if a large group decides to try and get in." Charlotte nodded, her mind already racing with plans. "Agreed. We should also consider what we'll do if, when, we need to leave here. The Hampton Inn isn't designed for long-term survival." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud bang from outside. Everyone in the lobby froze, eyes wide with terror. "It's starting," Noah said grimly, reaching for his wrench. "Charlotte, get everyone away from the windows and doors. I'll check the barricades." As Noah moved toward the source of the noise, Charlotte herded the guests toward the center of the lobby. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady as she spoke words of comfort and reassurance. The night that followed was long and terrifying. The sounds from outside, inhuman groans, desperate screams, and the occasional gunshot kept everyone on edge. Noah and Charlotte took turns patrolling the barricades, their eyes straining in the darkness for any sign of breach. Exhaustion had set in by morning, but there was no time for rest. The world outside had changed irrevocably, and they knew this was just the beginning of their fight for survival. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in their defenses, Noah and Charlotte stood side by side, surveying their makeshift fortress. The Hampton Inn, once a place of comfort for weary travelers, had become their last line of defense against the horrors that now roamed the streets of Chicopee. "We made it through the night," Charlotte said softly, allowing herself a small smile. Noah nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Yeah, we did. But this is just the start. We've got a long road ahead of us." Chapter 3: Shelter Amidst the Chaos. The sun crept over the horizon, casting an eerie, blood-orange glow on the desolate streets of Chicopee. Long shadows stretched across Memorial Drive, highlighting the wreckage of abandoned cars and debris littering the road. Noah stood at the second-floor window of the Hampton Inn, eyes fixed on the carnage below. What was once a bustling artery of the town now lay eerily silent, save for the occasional shuffling of the undead, their grotesque, jerking movements, a constant reminder of the nightmare outside. His heart pounded, each beat syncing with the thud of his pulse in his ears. The glass in front of him felt paper thin, as though the weight of the horror could shatter it at any moment. In the distance, he could see the once lively Walmart parking lot, now a graveyard of abandoned carts, trashed vehicles, and bodies, some still moving, most disturbingly. "How's it looking out there?" Charlotte's voice broke the silence, pulling him from his trance. Noah turned to see her standing just behind him, worry evident on her face. He gave her a grim smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Same as yesterday. Dead quiet, except for our new neighbors." His voice was tinged with dark humor, but the weight of the situation was heavy in his tone. Charlotte nodded, her usual warmth tempered by the tension of their predicament. "We need to take stock of our supplies. I've been trying to keep the guests calm, but they're getting restless." Her eyes flicked to the door, where muffled whispers and the occasional sob broke the unnerving quiet of the hotel. "Can't blame them," Noah muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He could feel the exhaustion settling deep into his bones, but there was no time for rest. "Let's gather everyone in the conference room. We need to come up with a plan." As they moved down the corridor, the oppressive weight of the hotel's atmosphere pressed down on them. Each closed door concealed families, travelers, and business people caught in the chaos, their whispered fears and quiet cries adding to the claustrophobic tension. Ever the reassuring figure, Charlotte stopped at each door, her voice soft but steady as she called the guests to the meeting. In the conference room, anxious faces greeted them, and the stark contrast of business suits and casual clothes was a jarring reminder of the world they had lost. People who had come to the hotel for meetings, vacations, or simple rest were now huddled together in fear, eyes wide with uncertainty. Noah stood at the front, scanning the room. The air was thick with panic, a silent thread binding them all. "All right, folks," Noah began, his voice firm despite the rising tension. "I know we're all scared, but we need to work together if we're going to survive this." The murmur of fear grew quieter as Charlotte stepped forward, her calm presence soothing some of the more frantic guests. "We've secured the hotel as best we can, but we need to be smart about our resources. Can anyone tell us what supplies they have in their rooms?" One by one, hands began to rise, and people called out food items, bottles of water, or basic first aid supplies. Noah jotted down notes on a whiteboard, quickly realizing how precarious their situation was. The vending machines had been picked clean, and the complimentary breakfast stock would last a few more days. "We need to ration," Noah said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. 3 small meals a day, minimal water usage, and we'll need security, inventory management, and sanitation volunteers. At first there was hesitation, but slowly hands went up. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit stood. "I was in the army. I can help with security rotations." A young woman followed. "I'm a nurse. I can tend to injuries and manage medical supplies." More volunteers trickled in, and the room breathed a little easier as they began to assign roles. Charlotte smiled at Noah. Her ability to manage people was a skill they would need moving forward in this new world. As the days passed, Noah and Charlotte settled into a rhythm. Noah's handyman skills were constantly used as he reinforced windows and doors, creating makeshift barricades from whatever they could find. Charlotte, ever the heart of the group, navigated the delicate emotional terrain, calming nerves and keeping the guests focused. On the 3rd day, Noah climbed to the roof with binoculars, Charlotte at his side. "Be careful," she warned, her hand brushing his arm. Noah nodded and raised the binoculars, his stomach sinking as he took in the landscape. Chicopee Street was a graveyard of twisted metal and wandering zombies. The Walmart supercenter had been ransacked, and Dick's Sporting Goods fared no better. Fires flickered in the distance, sending tendrils of smoke into the air, adding to the apocalyptic scene. "I can see the Walmart," Noah muttered. "It's been looted. Same with the sporting goods store." Charlotte sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Any sign of help?" "No," Noah replied grimly. "No police, no military. We're on our own." As they descended from the roof, a commotion from the lobby caught their attention. They rushed down to find a group of guests in a heated argument. "We can't just sit here and wait to die," a man shouted, his face flushed with anger. "We need to leave, find somewhere safer." "And go where?" Another guest retorted, her voice sharp with fear. It's a war zone out there. Noah stepped between them, his calm presence halting the rising panic. Hey, let's all take a breath. We're safer here than out there, trust me. Charlotte moved through the crowd, her soft voice easing tempers as she addressed each person's concerns. The tension slowly began to lift, and the group settled back into uneasy cooperation. That night, as Noah and Charlotte retreated to the kitchen, the weight of their leadership pressed heavily on them. "We can't keep this up forever," Noah said quietly, his voice betraying his exhaustion. "Sooner or later, we're going to run out of food." Charlotte nodded, her usual optimism dimmed. "I know, but sending anyone out there is too dangerous." Suddenly, a crash echoed from the parking lot. Noah grabbed a kitchen knife, his body tense as he moved toward the window. Outside, illuminated by flickering streetlights, a survivor was cornered by a group of zombies. "We have to help them," Charlotte whispered, her face pale with horror. Noah hesitated. "It's too risky. We don't know if they're infected." The survivor broke free, sprinting toward the hotel, zombies in close pursuit. His cries echoed through the night. "Help me, please!" With a curse, Noah grabbed a fire extinguisher and raced toward the lobby. Charlotte followed, her heart pounding. As the survivor reached the doors, Noah yanked him inside. At the same time, Charlotte unleashed a blast from the extinguisher, temporarily disorienting the zombies. Slamming the door shut, Noah turned to the man, his voice sharp. "Are you bit? Scratched?" The man shook his head frantically. No, I swear I'm clean. Thank you. Oh God, thank you." Charlotte quickly checked him for injuries, making sure he wasn't lying. "What's your name?" "Mike," he gasped. "I was trying to reach my family." Noah paced, his mind racing with the consequences of their decision. Letting Mike in could endanger them all, but the thought of leaving him to die was unbearable. "We'll need to isolate you for a while," Noah explained, "just to be sure you're not infected." Mike nodded gratefully. "Of course, I understand." As they settled Mike into a room, Noah and Charlotte exchanged a look. They had crossed a line tonight, one that could have dire consequences. The moral dilemmas of their new world were becoming all too real. The next morning, as Noah inspected the barricades, his heart sank. One of the makeshift defenses in the East Wing was beginning to fail, and the constant pressure from the zombies outside was taking its toll. "We've got a problem," Noah said, pulling Charlotte aside. "The East barricade is weakening. If we don't reinforce it, we will have a breach." Charlotte paled. "What do we need?" "Furniture, anything heavy. We need to move quietly, though. If those things hear us..." They gathered a group of volunteers, working silently and quickly to reinforce the barricade. As they worked, Noah marveled at how seamlessly he and Charlotte had fallen into their roles. They stood on the roof again that night, gazing over the ruined landscape. The fires and smoke filled the air and painted the horizon with an ominous orange glow. Ash fell from the sky as it was snowing, and the smoke lay like a heavy fog, a reminder of the world they had lost. "Do you think it'll ever go back to normal?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely a whisper. Noah was silent for a long time. "I don't know," he finally replied, his voice soft. "But I know we'll do everything we can to survive this. Together." Charlotte smiled, her hand finding his. In that small moment, amid the horror, they found hope. They still had a chance as long as they had each other and the community they were building. Chapter 4. Running Low. Dawn's light sliced through the poorly barricaded windows of the Hampton Inn, casting jagged shadows across the battered lobby. Noah and Charlotte stood in its eerie glow, eyes fixed on their meager stash of supplies, barely enough to last another day. The past few days had been a blur of terror and sleepless nights, each moment a fight to survive. Now, with exhaustion settling deep into their bones, a grim realization hit them. Survival was only going to get more complicated from here. Something far worse was coming. Noah ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his eyes fixed on the meager pile of food and water bottles. "We're in trouble, Charlotte," he said, his voice low and tinged with worry. "At this rate, we'll be out of supplies in less than a week." Charlotte nodded, her usual warm smile replaced by a look of determination. "We knew this day would come," she replied, her hospitality training kicking in as she maintained a calm demeanor. "We need to plan a supply run, and soon." The mere thought of stepping outside twisted a knot of fear deep in Noah's gut. He swallowed hard, his mind replaying the grotesque scenes he'd witnessed through the cracked hotel windows. Out there, the streets that once buzzed with life were now home to the hideous remains of what had once been friends and neighbors. Twisted, rotting figures staggered aimlessly, their lifeless eyes scanning for fresh prey, while the once familiar town had been reduced to a wasteland of decay and death. The air outside seemed thick with the stench of rot, and the constant moans of the undead seeped through every crack of the building. Noah clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. Charlotte stood beside him, her face set in grim determination, but he could see the fear hiding beneath the surface. She was right, though. They had no choice. Their supplies were nearly gone. The barricades wouldn't hold much longer, and staying inside was no longer safe. Yet the thought of venturing into that nightmare sent icy tendrils of dread crawling up his spine. Every step outside those walls was a step closer to death, or worse. BJ's Wholesale Club, Noah suggested, recalling the layout of Chicopee. It's not too far, and if it hasn't been completely looted, we might find enough to keep us going for a while. Charlotte nodded, her mind already racing with plans. We should check price right, too. It's on the way, and we might get lucky. As Noah and Charlotte huddled together, their whispered conversation growing more intense, the weight of their impending mission pressed down like a suffocating fog. Every detail mattered: the safest route, how much they could carry, the timing of their escape. The hotel had become their fortress, but its walls were crumbling, supplies dwindling, and the stench of death creeping ever closer. They knew they couldn't delay any longer. Suddenly, a shadow shifted near the hallway, and Mike, one of the survivors they'd dragged in days earlier, half dead with terror, stepped into view. His eyes darted nervously toward the windows, as if expecting the horrors outside to burst in at any moment. "I couldn't help but overhear," Mike muttered, his voice low but edged with lingering fear. He rubbed the back of his neck, his posture still betraying the shell shock of someone who had seen too much too fast. I want to help." Noah and Charlotte exchanged a wary glance, but Mike took a step closer before either could respond. His hand trembled slightly, but there was a newfound resolve in his eyes. "I know those stores you're planning to raid. I used to work over there before." He trailed off, swallowing hard before finding his voice again. "I know the layout like the back of my hand. I can guide you." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken tension for a brief moment. Was Mike ready for this? Could they trust him? Noah's mind raced through the possibilities, the dangers of bringing along someone still so clearly rattled by the nightmares outside. But they were running out of options, and the thought of having someone familiar with the area sent a flicker of hope through the crushing dread. Charlotte, always the first to break the silence, studied Mike's face with sharp, calculating eyes. "You sure you're up for this?" she asked. Her voice laced with suspicion but tinged with something more. Hope, maybe. Mike hesitated, visibly fighting the fear bubbling beneath the surface, but nodded. "I don't have a choice either," he said, the weight of the situation clear in his words. "If we don't make a move soon, none of us are getting out of here alive." Noah felt his chest tighten. The decision had already been made. Noah and Charlotte exchanged glances, silently weighing the risks and benefits of bringing another person along. Finally, Noah nodded. "All right, Mike, we could use the extra hands and your knowledge. But you follow our lead, understood?" Mike nodded eagerly, relief washing over his face at the chance to contribute. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as they prepared for the scavenging trip. Noah gathered what tools he could from the maintenance room: hammers, screwdrivers, anything that could double as a weapon in a pinch. Charlotte organized backpacks with water and what little food they could spare, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios and how to handle them. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh light over the desolate parking lot, the trio stood at the hotel's main entrance. Noah took a deep breath, his hand resting on the makeshift barricade. "Ready?" he asked, looking at his companions. Charlotte nodded, her jaw set with determination. Mike swallowed hard, but gave a shaky thumbs up. With a grunt of effort, Noah pushed aside the barricade, and they stepped out into the changed world. The stench hit them like a wall, a sickening blend of rot, death, and something far more sinister, something that didn't belong in the world they once knew. It clung to the thick and heavy air, forcing Noah and Charlotte to stifle their gag reflexes as they cautiously stepped into the desolate streets of Chicopee. The town that had once bustled with life, where children played and neighbors greeted each other, now lay in a suffocating silence that felt almost unnatural. The remnants of civilization's collapse were scattered everywhere and looked like broken memories. Overturned cars lay rusting in the streets, their windows shattered and doors flung open as if in mid-escape. Weeds had already begun to creep through the cracks in the pavement, nature reclaiming what humanity had abandoned in its desperation to flee. The once familiar hum of traffic and the distant chatter of people were long gone, replaced by an eerie quiet that amplified every crunch of glass beneath their boots. In the distance, a thin, lazy plume of smoke curled into the pale sky, a silent reminder that something, or someone, was still out there. They couldn't be sure whether it was another survivor or something far worse. Noah's eyes darted to the buildings that lined the streets, grocery stores, diners, homes, once so inviting, now looming with broken windows and darkened doorways like the hollow eyes of skulls. Each shadow seemed to shift with potential danger, as if the town had become a predator waiting for its next victim. The wind, once a gentle breeze that carried the sounds of life, now howled softly through the abandoned streets, carrying with it the faintest sound, moans distant but unmistakable. Noah's pulse quickened, the primal fear gnawing at him. There was no mistaking it now. The undead were near, and every step they took brought them closer to whatever horror was lurking just beyond sight. Charlotte tightened her grip on the makeshift weapon, her knuckles white. "We need to move, now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. Noah nodded, his throat dry. The streets of Chicopee had become a graveyard, but they had no choice but to venture deeper into its decaying heart. "Stay low, stay quiet," Noah whispered, leading the way down Memorial Drive. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound a potential harbinger of danger. They passed the Walmart Supercenter, its vast parking lot, a graveyard of abandoned shopping carts and discarded personal belongings. As they neared the shattered entrance of Price Right, the familiar weight of dread settled over Noah's shoulders. The air here seemed even more stagnant, thick with the sour stench of death that permeated the abandoned parking lot. As Charlotte motioned for him to press forward, a sharp, shuffling sound echoed behind a nearby car, sending them diving for cover. Noah's heart slammed against his chest as he crouched behind the rusting vehicle, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He gripped the cold metal of his crowbar, its surface slick with sweat, and peered cautiously around the bumper. There it was, a lone zombie, barely more than 20 feet away, stumbling aimlessly between the broken remains of shopping carts and debris. The creature had once been a middle-aged woman, her floral dress now torn open and blood-stained, clinging to her skeletal frame. One boob was missing, and the other had a silicone bag halfway hanging out. Clearly she had a breast job at one point. Her skin was a sickly shade of gray, mottled with patches of decay, and her lifeless eyes were clouded with a milky haze. She shuffled with an awkward, unnatural sound, her twisted limbs jerking with every unsteady step, her mouth hanging open as if frozen in mid-scream. Noah's pulse quickened as he glanced at Charlotte. She nodded, a silent agreement passing between them, no hesitation. This was survival. Slowly, he rose from his crouch, moving with deliberate, practiced precision. His muscles tensed as he crept toward the zombie, every step carefully placed to avoid drawing attention. The sound of her grotesque moaning filled his ears as he closed the distance. Just as the zombie paused, its head tilting to the side in confusion, Noah lunged. In one swift motion, he swung the crowbar with all his strength, the weight of it slamming into the side of her skull with a sickening crunch. The impact sent a spray of dark, coagulated blood splattering across the pavement. The zombie's head snapped to the side with an unnatural jerk. Still, she didn't fall immediately, her body twitching as if trying to resist death once again. Noah didn't wait. He stepped forward, raising the crowbar above his head and bringing it down in a brutal arc. This time, the metal bar crashed through her skull with a wet thud, shattering bone and sending her collapsing to the ground in a heap. The parking lot echoed with the hollow sound of her body hitting the pavement, followed by the eerie silence that followed each kill. Breathing hard, Noah glanced down at the crumpled body, black blood pooling beneath the mangled remains of her head. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped the crowbar on his pant leg, trying to steady himself. Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes scanning the lot for any other signs of movement. "Nice work," she murmured, her voice low. She was already moving, motioning for Noah to follow. "Let's go. The longer we stay out here, the more of them will draw." Noah looked at the broken shell of what had once been human before hurrying after her, his heart still racing. The price right loomed ahead, but the real danger was everywhere, hiding in every shadow, waiting for one misstep. "We can go around," Charlotte whispered, her hand on Noah's arm. He nodded, guiding the group in a wide arc around the threat. Price Right's windows were shattered, and the interior lay in chaos. They moved cautiously through the aisles, grabbing whatever non-perishables they could find. It wasn't much, a few cans of vegetables, some packets of dried fruit, but every little bit counted. As they exited the store, Mike's foot caught on a piece of debris, sending him sprawling with a yelp. The sound echoed in the empty lot, and time seemed to stand still for a moment. Then, from all directions, came the groans and shuffling footsteps of the undead. "Run!" Noah shouted, abandoning all pretense of stealth. They sprinted down Memorial Drive, the moans of pursuing zombies growing louder behind them. Charlotte's lungs burned as she pushed herself to keep pace, her backpack heavy with their meager findings. They rounded a corner, and Noah's heart sank. A group of zombies blocked their path to BJ's wholesale club. "This way," he called, veering off towards a side street. They ducked between buildings, the sounds of pursuit never far behind. As they emerged onto Chicopee Street, Noah spotted a familiar sign. "The Residence Inn," he gasped between breaths. "We can hole up there until it's clear." They made a desperate dash for the hotel, zombies closing in from all sides. Noah reached the door, yanking it open and ushering Charlotte and Mike inside. He slammed it shut just as rotting hands began to claw at the glass. They huddled in the lobby for several tense minutes, listening to the scraping and moaning outside. Gradually, the sounds faded as the horde lost interest and shambled away. "That was too close," Charlotte said, her voice shaky but relieved. She looked around the Residence Inn's lobby, taking in its untouched state. "This place, it's in much better condition than the Hampton." Noah nodded, his mind already working through the implications. "Better layout for defense, too. Multiple floors, more rooms for supplies." He trailed off, meeting Charlotte's gaze. They both knew what this meant. As the adrenaline of their near-death experience faded, the gravity of their situation settled in. They risked everything and came away with barely enough supplies to last a few days. The Hampton Inn, their sanctuary for the past week, quickly became untenable. "We can't stay at the Hampton much longer," Noah said, voicing what they were all thinking. "We're running out of food, water, everything, and after today, we know how dangerous it is out there." Charlotte nodded, glancing around the spacious lobby of the Residence Inn. "This place is a much better long-term solution. We've got more space to spread out, and it seems like there are still some supplies we can scavenge. Plus, further from the town center, it should be safer here." Mike, who had been quiet since their arrival, spoke up. "But what about the others back at the Hampton? We can't just abandon them." Noah ran a hand through his hair, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "We won't," he said firmly. "We'll go back, tell them what we found, plan a careful evacuation. It's risky, but our best shot at long-term survival." As they caught their breath and prepared for the perilous journey back to the Hampton Inn, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. They had ventured out into the zombie-infested world and survived, but the meager supplies in their backpacks were a stark reminder of their challenges. Yet as he looked at Charlotte's determined face and felt the solid presence of the Residence Inn around them, a glimmer of hope sparked in Noah's chest. They had found a potential new sanctuary, a place where they could build something lasting in this broken world. The fading sunlight bathed the crumbling landscape of Chicopee in a ghostly orange hue as Noah and Charlotte stepped out of the Residence Inn. The long shadows stretched across the desolate streets like dark tendrils, creeping ever closer as night threatened to swallow the town whole. The air was unnervingly still, save for the distant rustle of wind pushing through abandoned buildings and the faint, unsettling groans that seemed to drift from nowhere. Each sound echoed in the growing silence, amplifying the feeling that something was watching, waiting. Noah paused on the sidewalk, staring down the empty stretch of road ahead. It wasn't just the cold that sent a shiver up his spine. It was the feeling of being trapped between the living and the dead, the sense that this town, his home, was no longer his own. The world had twisted into something else, something unrecognizable, and now the shadows seemed to breathe with a life of their own. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and decay, and steeled himself for the grim journey ahead. The road stretched endlessly, lined with overturned cars and shattered windows, like a graveyard for the life they once knew. Behind every corner, in every dark alley, he knew there could be eyes, unblinking, hungry eyes, waiting to find them. Noah glanced at Charlotte, her face set in a mask of quiet determination. She didn't speak, but her eyes held the same exhaustion he felt, the weight of survival, the endless struggle to stay one step ahead of death. "Let's go home," he said, his voice low and hoarse, carrying a mix of weariness and quiet resolve. The words felt strange and hollow, as if home was a place that no longer existed in this broken, haunted world. But he said them anyway, trying to cling to the idea that they could still carve out a place that was theirs somewhere. He looked down the street again, his eyes tracing the jagged skyline of broken rooftops and skeletal trees, the distant flickering lights of fire illuminating the evening sky like a fading signal. "We've got plans to make," Noah added, more to himself than to her, as he tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon. The sinking sun cast long fingers of darkness over the town, and they had no choice but to walk straight into it. There was no turning back now, only forward, deeper into the unknown, where the living feared to tread. Chapter 5: Evacuation Decision. The Hampton Inn's lobby, once a welcoming refuge for weary travelers, now resembled a war zone, bearing the brutal scars of a week-long siege. What had once been pristine marble floors were now scuffed and stained, littered with debris from hastily constructed barricades. Broken chairs, upturned tables, and maintenance equipment formed crude walls around the shattered glass doors, barely holding back the horrors outside. The air was thick with dust and the sour stench of fear, while the dim emergency lights flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to slither across the walls like ghosts. Noah stood behind the front desk, his fingers gripping its edge so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His hands, once steady and sure, were now rough and calloused from days of physical labor and countless near misses with death. The surface beneath his hands was smeared with grime, a far cry from the polished counter that had once greeted guests. Now it served as a command post, and he felt the crushing weight of responsibility bearing down on him with every passing second. He glanced toward their dwindling pile of supplies, just a few cans of food, a half-empty water jug, and some first aid items. Each piece was a bitter reminder of how little time they had left. It was a cruel joke, watching what little remained slowly disappear, knowing the world outside held nothing but death. Noah's breath caught in his throat as he took in the bleak reality of their situation. The dark circles beneath his eyes were like bruises, growing deeper with each sleepless night. His stubble had long since turned into a scruffy beard, another sign of how quickly the world had fallen apart. Leadership had not come easily to him, but it was a role he could not escape. The others looked to him for guidance, and with each passing day, their hollow eyes spoke louder than any words. What now? The room was quiet, save for the faint creak of the barricades settling and the distant muted moans that seemed to creep through every crack in the walls. Outside, death waited patiently and relentlessly. Inside, despair gnawed at the survivors' resolve, tearing at their fragile hope. Noah exhaled shakily, his eyes sweeping over the makeshift fortress they had built, a cage just as much as it was a refuge. It wouldn't hold forever. Nothing did. The barricades, like their will to survive, were wearing thin, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escape, relief, or cavalry coming to save them. They were alone, trapped in a slow spiral of death and starvation. "We're running out of time," he whispered, though the words echoed in the empty, haunted space around him. "How much longer can we hold on?" Noah turned away from the desk with a heavy sigh, casting one last glance at their meager supplies. He felt the weight of every decision pressed down on his shoulders like 1,000 invisible hands, pulling him deeper into despair he couldn't shake. The future stretched out before him like a vast, endless wasteland. With each passing hour, the horizon of hope grew further and further away. Charlotte approached, her usual warm smile replaced by a look of concern. "How are we looking?" she asked, her voice low to avoid alarming nearby survivors. Noah shook his head grimly. "Not good. We've got maybe 3 days of food left, and that's if we cut rations even further." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "And the water situation isn't much better." Charlotte nodded as she considered their options. "We could try another scavenging run, but after what happened last time—" Her voice trailed off, remembering their close call at the nearby price right. "It's too risky," Noah said firmly. "Our defenses are weakening by the day. Did you see the cracks forming in the barricade near the conference room? It's only a matter of time before they break through." As if on cue, a distant moan echoed through the halls, followed by shuffling feet and scratching at the walls. The zombies outside were growing more persistent, their hunger seemingly insatiable. Charlotte shuddered. "We can't stay here much longer, can we?" Noah shook his head. "I've been thinking about that. Remember the Residence Inn over on Memorial Drive? It's bigger, newer, might have better resources and be easier to defend." "That's nearly 2 miles away," Charlotte said, her brow furrowing, "through God knows how many of those things." "I know it's risky," Noah admitted, "but we're running out of options here. If we stay, we starve. If we go—" He left the alternative unspoken, but they knew the dangers beyond their fragile sanctuary. Charlotte took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Okay, let's call a meeting. If we do this, we need to present this to the group and start planning." Within the hour, the survivors had gathered in the hotel's largest conference room, the eerie silence hanging over them like a dark cloud. Once a space for business meetings, wedding receptions, and local events, the room now bore the weight of something far more sinister: survival. The once bright carpet was stained with dirt, debris, and faint traces of blood, a reminder of the battles fought outside these walls. Makeshift curtains hung from broken windows, barely keeping out the chill of the October air or the distant moans that drifted in on the wind. The tables, which had once held catering platters and business brochures, were now covered in hastily scribbled maps of Chicopee, marking every zombie hotspot and potential escape route. Some sections were heavily crossed out, areas too dangerous to even consider. Other parts, marked with question marks, held the thin hope of safety but no guarantees. The maps were worn from use, the ink smudged and faded, just like the survivors. Noah stood at the front of the room, his eyes sweeping over the ragtag group of people who had clung to this fragile sanctuary. Their faces were pale, gaunt from hunger and fear, their eyes hollow, showing the toll of sleepless nights and the weight of despair that hung over them like a storm cloud. Some had injuries hastily bandaged, while others clutched their makeshift weapons as if expecting death to break through the door at any moment. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady as he began to speak, masking the turmoil within. "I know you're all scared," he started, his eyes meeting those of the people who had come to depend on him for guidance, though he had never asked for this burden. "Hell, I'm scared too." His words hung in the air, the admission of fear hitting the room like a punch to the gut. For a moment, no one breathed. It was a truth they all shared, but rarely spoke aloud. The fear wasn't just of the zombies clawing at the walls or the nights filled with distant screams. It was the fear of the unknown and that they were running out of time. Noah's gaze dropped to the maps momentarily, the routes they'd discussed already seeming like foolish gambles. "But we can't stay here much longer," he continued, his voice growing graver with each word. "Our supplies are almost gone." He motioned to the back of the room where their dwindling rations were stacked, a pitiful assortment of canned goods and bottled water, not enough to last another week. "And these walls, these barricades, they won't hold forever." The room was deathly silent, the weight of his words sinking into the bones of every survivor. Standing near the back, Charlotte crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the floor. Sitting with his back against the wall, Mike looked like he hadn't slept in days, his sunken eyes barely lifting to meet Noah's. They were all exhausted, physically and mentally, and the despair was creeping in like a slow poison. Noah took a deep breath, fighting the tightening in his chest. He wanted to offer them hope, but every option seemed like a losing bet. "We need to move," he said, his voice quieter now but no less urgent. "We can't keep pretending we're safe here. If we wait too long, we'll be trapped." He glanced at the maps again, seeing the web of streets and dead ends, the routes they'd planned to take. But the truth was, he didn't know if any of those paths led to safety. Every corner of the town seemed infested, every turn more dangerous than the last. And if the zombies didn't get them, starvation would. A murmur of quiet discussion rippled through the room as the survivors processed his words. Some of them clung to the hope of a miracle, some unknown force swooping in to save them. Others, like Noah, understood that no help was coming. They were alone. "We don't have many options," Noah said, raising his voice slightly to cut through the murmurs. "But sitting here waiting to die isn't one of them." His words were met with silence again, but this time it was a silence filled with despair. They all knew he was right. The hotel had become their prison, and staying meant death. But the thought of stepping outside, into the chaos and carnage overtaking Chicopee, was almost unbearable. Every survivor in that room had seen too much, lost too much. And now they faced the most brutal truth. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Noah's hands trembled as he gripped the table's edge before him. "I wish I had better answers," he admitted, his voice cracking just enough to reveal the weight of his own fear. "But the only thing we can do now is fight for what's left. And hope it's enough." The despair in the room was thick and suffocating, but behind it, a flicker of resolve stirred. They had no choice but to face the nightmare head-on, and Noah's words had made sure of that. Murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd. Mike, the survivor they'd rescued days earlier, spoke up. "Where would we go? It's a war zone out there." "The Residence Inn," Noah replied, pointing to its location on the map. "It's bigger, more secure, and might have desperately needed supplies." Charlotte stepped forward, her presence calming as she addressed the group. "We understand this is frightening, but together we've survived this far. We can make it if we work as a team." The former police officer, Frank, a gruff man, nodded in agreement. "She's right. Staying put is a death sentence. At least out there, we've got a fighting chance." As the group discussed the plan, Noah and Charlotte worked to address concerns and organize their strategy. They pored over maps, plotting the safest route along Memorial Drive, considering potential obstacles and escape routes. "We'll need to move fast and quiet," Noah explained, tracing their path. "There's a Walmart supercenter and a Dick's Sporting Goods along the way. If we're lucky, we might be able to grab some supplies en route." The tech-savvy teenager, Alex, piped up. "What about transportation? We can't all walk that far, especially with supplies." Noah nodded. "Good point. There are a few cars in the parking lot. We'll need to hotwire them, but it'll give us a better chance of making it." As the day wore on, the plan took shape. They would leave at first light, using the early morning hours when the zombies seemed less active. The group was divided into teams, each with specific responsibilities: drivers, lookouts, and those tasked with carrying essential supplies. That night, as the others tried to rest, Noah and Charlotte stood on the roof, gazing out at the changed landscape of their town. The streets below were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional groan or shuffling of the undead. "Do you think we're making the right call?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah turned to her, his expression a mix of determination and fear. "Honestly, I don't know, but I do know we can't stay here and slowly die. At least this way, we're fighting for a chance." Charlotte nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad you're here. We wouldn't have made it this far without you." Noah managed a small smile. "Same goes for you. Your ability to keep everyone calm and focused, it's been our secret weapon." The survivors gathered in the lobby as dawn broke, casting a pale light over the devastated town. Faces were grim but determined as Noah and Charlotte went over the plan one last time. "Remember," Noah said, his voice steady, "we move fast, we stay quiet, and we stick together. Anyone who falls behind." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. We'll do our best to help, but the group's survival has to come first. Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes meeting each survivor's gaze. We've made it this far together. Trust each other, and we'll make it through too. With a final check of their meager supplies and improvised weapons, Noah led the way to the barricaded entrance. He and Frank worked to quietly dismantle the blockade, every creak and groan setting nerves on edge. The nightmare outside unfolded in chilling detail as the heavy doors creaked open. The devastation was far worse than they had imagined. The street was a graveyard of abandoned cars, their metal husks rusting and twisted, some still containing the grisly remains of those who hadn't made it out in time. Bodies slumped lifelessly in seats, their faces frozen in terror, rotting in the suffocating silence. The shopping centers that had once been alive with people were now hollowed-out shells, their windows shattered, jagged glass gleaming ominously in the weak morning light. Doors hung crookedly from their hinges, swaying ever so slightly in the breeze, giving the eerie impression that the buildings themselves were gasping their last breaths. Noah stood in the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest as he took it all in. The world had crumbled around them, swallowed by death and decay. The weight of it pressed down on him, but there was no time for hesitation. He closed his eyes briefly, forcing down the rising dread that threatened to paralyze him. When he opened them again, there was only grim determination. "All right," he whispered, barely loud enough for the others to hear, his voice trembling with the effort of keeping fear at bay. "Let's move." The group stepped cautiously into the pale morning light, the air cold and thick with the stench of rot. Their footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one carefully placed to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Every rustle of leaves, every distant creak or groan made them jumpy, their nerves frayed by days of relentless tension. Charlotte took up the rear, her eyes darting from side to side, ever vigilant, her hand gripping the makeshift weapon. She was the guardian, ensuring no one lagged behind, and they wouldn't be caught off guard. The town, once vibrant and bustling with life, now lay in the grip of something far darker. Overhead, the sky was a muted gray, the sun struggling to pierce through the clouds, casting long, twisted shadows across the street. They moved as one, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide and alert, each of them aware that death could spring from any shadow, from any corner. As they approached Memorial Drive, the distant moans of the undead began to echo through the streets, low and guttural, like the sound of a predator hunting in the dark. It was a sound they had grown accustomed to, yet it never ceased to chill them to the bone. The moans were a constant reminder that the danger was always there, unseen, yet never far away. It was a slow, creeping threat that could strike at any moment. Noah's heart pounded as the group pressed on, the moans growing louder with each step, a grim reminder of the horrors that lurked just out of sight. Every shadow felt like it could hide one of the shambling dead, and every corner felt like a potential death trap. The city had become a labyrinth of decay and dread, and they were nothing more than prey, trying to stay one step ahead of the inevitable. "Keep close," Noah muttered, though his words felt hollow. They all knew the truth. Safety was an illusion out here, and survival was never guaranteed. As they moved deeper into the wasteland that was once their home, the oppressive silence was broken only by the haunting wails of the undead. And with each passing second, the sense of impending doom crept ever closer, like the cold fingers of death reaching out from the shadows. Their journey had only just begun, but already the weight of their decision pressed down upon them. The relative safety of the Hampton Inn faded behind them as they ventured into the unknown, their hopes pinned on the promise of sanctuary at the Residence Inn. As they rounded a corner, a small horde of zombies came into view, blocking their path. Noah raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. He exchanged a look with Charlotte, knowing their plan was about to face its first real test. Chapter 6. The Move to Residence Inn. As they rounded the corner, a small horde of zombies shuffled into view, blocking their path. Noah felt his stomach drop at the sight. There had to be at least a dozen of them, their decaying forms lurching aimlessly, groaning in hunger. Their torn clothing flapped in the breeze, and the scent of rot clung to the air. Noah raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. His heart pounded as he exchanged a look with Charlotte, the silent acknowledgement passing between them. Their plan was about to face its first real test. The zombies hadn't spotted them yet, their milky eyes scanning the distance, unaware of the fresh meat standing just a few yards away. Noah knew their time was running out. Any sudden noise or scent would bring the horde crashing down on them. He glanced over at Greg, the cop they'd picked up days ago, who had his gun drawn, the barrel trembling slightly as his finger hovered over the trigger. Beside him, a woman named Liz, who had fashioned a spear from a broken mop handle and a sharpened piece of metal, tightened her grip on her weapon, her knuckles turning white. Noah took a deep breath. "We take them down quick and quiet if we can," he whispered. "We can't afford to get surrounded." Greg's hand tightened on his pistol, and he gave a quick nod. Noah nodded back, signaling the start of their assault. As the first zombie turned, its clouded eyes locking onto them with a grotesque moan, Noah moved in fast, raising his pipe. He swung hard, the metal bar connecting with the zombie's skull, shattering bone with a sickening crunch. The creature collapsed to the ground, its body twitching violently before going still. But the moan had already alerted the rest of the horde. Two more zombies jerked their heads toward the group, their jaws snapping open as they lunged forward, hunger driving them. Greg, his breath steady, aimed his gun and fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the street, louder than Noah had hoped for. The bullet hit the zombie square between the eyes, and it dropped like a puppet with its strings cut, its body crumpling into the pavement with a dull thud. "Damn it!" Greg muttered, knowing the noise would draw more of the undead. Noah barely had time to react as another zombie, its face half torn off, staggered toward him. He swung the pipe again, catching it in the ribs, but it barely slowed. The creature lunged, fingers clawing at his jacket, and just as Noah was about to lose his balance, Liz appeared at his side, her makeshift spear thrusting forward with deadly precision. The sharp metal tip plunged into the zombie's temple, and with a gurgling moan, the undead creature collapsed at their feet. "Nice one," Noah panted, nodding his thanks to Liz. "Behind you." Charlotte's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and panicked. Noah spun just as another zombie lunged at him from the side, its rotting hands outstretched. He barely had time to raise his weapon before Greg fired again, the shot blasting through the creature's skull. Dark, congealed blood splattered across the pavement as the zombie dropped, lifeless. But the noise was drawing more of them. In the distance, Noah could hear the unmistakable moans of another group of zombies drawn by the gunfire. His pulse quickened as he scanned the street, his eyes darting between the shambling bodies and the survivors by his side. "We need to move," Noah shouted, his voice thick with urgency. "We can't handle another wave." Liz pulled her spear free from the crumpled zombie at her feet, her hands shaking, but her resolve unbroken. Charlotte swung her crowbar at a nearby zombie, caving in its skull with a brutal, final blow, then quickly fell back into position. The group surged forward, trying to break through the thinning horde. Noah slammed his pipe into the head of another zombie, the impact sending a jolt through his arms. Greg fired another shot, taking out a zombie that was too close to Charlotte. Liz, breathless but fierce, stabbed at another zombie with her spear, her face set in grim concentration as she drove the point through its skull. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the zombies collapsed. Blood and gore stained the pavement, pooling beneath the bodies of the undead. Noah stood, panting, his arms aching from the repeated blows. Around him, the survivors caught their breath, their faces pale and drawn but alive. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence almost deafening in the fight's aftermath. Greg holstered his gun, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of more trouble. "We did it," Liz muttered, wiping the blood from her hands, her voice thick with exhaustion. Noah nodded, glancing at the others. "For now," he said, his voice grim, "but we need to keep moving. That gunshot's going to bring more of them. We're not out of this yet." With one last look at the carnage they'd left behind, the group pressed on, their steps quick and careful as they disappeared into the eerie quiet of the desolate streets. "I don't think we can handle another horde," Noah said to the group as he looked upon the tired and winded people he was tasked to guide and help. "We need to move and move fast, keep quiet, and keep our eyes open for more of those things." Charlotte nodded, her hand resting reassuringly on the shoulder of an elderly guest who looked close to panic. "We've got this," she mouthed, her eyes conveying a confidence she didn't feel. As they navigated the once familiar landscape of Memorial Drive, the true extent of the devastation became apparent. Abandoned cars littered the road, their windows shattered and doors hanging open. The Walmart Supercenter, once a bustling hub of activity, now stood as a silent reminder of how things are now in this new world. Its parking lot, a graveyard of shopping carts, discarded merchandise, and bloody bodies of the people who didn't make it. Halfway down the street, a sudden movement caught Noah's attention. He raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. From behind an overturned truck emerged a horde of zombies, their decaying forms shuffling toward the survivors with terrifying purpose. "Change of plans," Noah hissed, his mind racing. "Everyone, into Dick's Sporting Goods, now!" The group sprinted towards the store, adrenaline masking the burn in their legs. Charlotte ushered the slower members along, her voice a soothing balm against the rising tide of panic. As they reached the entrance, Noah and Mike, the survivor they had rescued earlier, worked in tandem to pry open the doors. Once inside, they barricaded the entrance with whatever they could find: display racks, cash registers, anything to buy them precious time. The zombies outside threw themselves against the glass, their mindless determination a stark contrast to the fear etched on the faces of the living. "We need to find another way out," Noah said, eyes scanning the store's layout. "Charlotte, take half the group and see if you can find anything useful. Weapons, food, anything. Mike and I will look for a back exit." Charlotte organized the survivors into small teams. "Stay close, stay quiet, and if you see anything, call out," she instructed, her calm demeanor, which is a lifeline for the frightened group. The store was eerily quiet inside, save for the relentless thudding of the undead pounding against the storefront windows. The sound echoed through the aisles, a sickening, rhythmic reminder of the danger lurking on the other side of the glass. Each thud sent a shiver down Noah's spine, as if the thin barrier between life and death could give way at any moment. He and Mike moved quickly, their eyes scanning the dimly lit store for any way out. Their footsteps were careful, yet each movement felt amplified in the stillness, the oppressive atmosphere thick with dread. After what felt like an eternity, Noah's flashlight flickered across the outline of a metal door at the back of the store. His heart leaped. A fire exit. He and Mike rushed over, their breaths coming in shallow bursts. Noah pushed the door slightly, and an excellent air draft swept in. The door led to a small, narrow alley behind the building, but even that little breath of freedom felt like salvation. "Back here!" Noah whispered harshly to the others, waving them over. Meanwhile, Charlotte's group worked quickly, moving through the disheveled aisles with purpose. The shelves had long been looted, but they'd managed to scavenge a few valuable items: energy bars, bottles of water, and 3 baseball bats that would make good makeshift weapons. Charlotte tossed one to Liz, who caught it and gave a determined nod, gripping the bat like a lifeline. The constant pounding from the zombies outside intensified as if the creatures could smell fresh prey just beyond the glass. The moans grew louder and more insistent as the undead communicated their shared hunger. "Good work," Noah said as they all regrouped by the fire exit, his voice steady but tense. "But we need to move fast. The noise we've made is going to draw more of them. We can't stay here." He moved to the door, his hand on the cold metal handle, but his heart plummeted as he cracked it open to peer outside. In the dim light of the alley, a small group of zombies had already gathered, their bodies swaying in that grotesque, unnatural way. They were drawn by the commotion, their heads jerking from side to side as they sniffed the air like predators who had caught the scent of their next meal. Their dead eyes glowed with a hunger that sent chills down Noah's spine. He turned back to the group, his eyes locking with Charlotte's. In that brief moment, nothing needed to be said. They had faced enough horror to understand what had to be done. Their time was up, and if they didn't act fast, they'd be trapped between the horde outside and the relentless pounding behind them. "We clear the alley," Noah said, his voice low but firm. He gripped his rusted pipe, feeling its weight in his hand. Charlotte nodded, her grip tightening on the crowbar. Behind her, Liz hefted the baseball bat, her knuckles white with tension, while Greg checked his gun, ensuring it was ready to fire. With a quick, silent gesture, Noah eased the door open further, the zombies' groans growing louder as they caught sight of the group. The first lurched forward, its fingers outstretched, blackened nails clawing at the air. Noah swung hard, his pipe connecting with its skull in a wet, sickening crunch. The zombie crumpled to the ground, twitching for a moment before going still, but two more were already closing in. Charlotte darted forward, her crowbar flashing as she drove it into the head of the nearest creature, yanking it free just as the next one reached for her. A zombie stumbled toward Liz, its grotesque, rotting face inches from hers. With a shout, she swung the bat with all her strength, the impact sending the creature flying back into the wall with a sickening thud. Blood and decay sprayed across the alley as the zombie collapsed, unmoving. Greg stepped in next, his gun leveled at the remaining zombies. He fired twice in quick succession. The shots echoed loudly, but the bullets found their mark, dropping the creatures instantly. The alley was momentarily quiet, the dead lying in heaps around them, their grotesque forms illuminated by the pale light spilling from the fire exit. Noah's breath came in ragged gasps, his body tense and aching from the fight. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the alley for any more threats. But the zombies in the street behind the store were still hammering at the front, unaware of the group's escape. "We need to move before more show up," Charlotte urged, her voice strained with urgency. Noah nodded, motioning for the group to follow as they hurried down the alley, each glancing back over their shoulders, knowing that more of the undead could appear. They had cleared this hurdle, but Noah knew it was only the beginning. The horde was relentless, and survival meant constantly staying one step ahead. Their senses were on high alert as they disappeared into the shadowed streets. Every creak, every distant moan was a reminder that death was never far behind. "I'll draw them away," Noah said, his voice low but firm. "Once they're clear, get everyone to the Residence Inn. It's not far from here." Charlotte's eyes widened. "Noah, no, it's too dangerous." "We don't have a choice," he replied, squeezing hers briefly. "I'll meet you there, I promise." Before anyone could protest further, Noah burst out of the fire exit, shouting and waving his arms. The zombies' decaying faces, twisted in hunger, turned towards him as one. As he led them away from the store, Charlotte fought back tears and focused on the task. "Let's move," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "Stay close and stay quiet." The group burst out of Dick's Sporting Goods, their hearts racing, adrenaline surging through their veins. Eyes wide and alert, they scanned the darkened street, every shadow and creak sending shivers of fear down their spines. The distant sound of Noah's frantic shouts echoed through the air, each cry a sharp reminder of the sacrifice he was making, risking everything to buy them a few more precious moments. Charlotte's chest tightened with worry, but they couldn't afford to stop. They needed to make it to the Residence Inn. But as they rounded the corner, their destination finally in sight, her heart leapt into her throat. A massive horde of zombies, dozens of them, had gathered in front of the Residence Inn, their decaying bodies swaying and groaning in a sickening chorus. Their grotesque, sunken eyes locked onto the group almost immediately, and the moaning intensified, a blood-chilling sound that rattled in their ears. The entrance was completely blocked by a wall of the undead, their rotting arms outstretched as if reaching for fresh meat. The group froze, paralyzed by the nightmare unfolding before them. Panic gripped Charlotte like a vice. They were trapped, no way in, no way out. Despair clawed at her chest, threatening to consume her as she frantically searched for another way, any way, to get through. As her thoughts spiraled into hopelessness, a sharp voice cut through the rising terror. "Over here!" Charlotte's head snapped up, her heart beating as she spotted Noah on a nearby rooftop. His clothes were ragged, and blood streaked his arms, but there he was, alive. He had somehow managed to circle back and was now gesturing wildly toward a fire escape clinging to the side of the building. Without hesitation, Charlotte snapped into action, pulling the others with her. "Go!" she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear pounding in her chest. They bolted toward the alley where Noah had reappeared, dodging debris and broken glass as the moans behind them grew louder and more frantic. The horde had caught their scent, and the creatures began to shamble toward them in a wave of rotting flesh and death. "Move!" Charlotte yelled as the group scrambled toward the fire escape, their feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The zombies were closing in fast, but Noah leaned over the roof's edge, his hand outstretched to help them up. One by one, they scaled the ladder, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, hearts pounding with the fear of what was closing in behind them. As Charlotte reached the ladder, she glanced back. The horde was almost upon them, just a few feet away, their bony fingers stretching for her. The smell of decay was overwhelming, but she gritted her teeth, grabbed hold of the metal rungs, and climbed. Noah's strong hand gripped hers, pulling her onto the rooftop just as the first zombie slammed into the fire escape, snarling and snapping at the air where she had been moments before. Panting, Charlotte collapsed onto the rooftop beside Noah, her heart hammering in her chest. The others gathered around, their faces pale and streaked with sweat, but they were alive. They had made it, for now. Noah stood, his breath ragged but his eyes sharp. "We're not safe yet," he muttered, glancing down at the street below, where the horde still swarmed. "But we've bought ourselves some time." Charlotte nodded, her pulse still racing. They had escaped death's grip by the slimmest of margins, but the fight was far from over. The zombies were relentless, and the subsequent battle was already lurking. Noah's face was streaked with sweat and grime, but his eyes shone with determination. "I found a way in through the maintenance access," he explained breathlessly. "We can secure it from the inside." As they descended into the Residence Inn, the stark contrast between the sanctuary they'd stumbled upon and the horrors outside was almost surreal. The oppressive noise of the undead, a constant soundtrack of groaning, shuffling, and scraping, faded away, replaced by a deafening silence. The air inside was still and untouched, a ghostly calm so out of place it felt dreamlike. The halls were pristine, unmarked by the chaos that had ravaged the outside world. Carpeted floors, polished wood, and framed pictures of serene landscapes lined the walls, a reminder of the normalcy that once existed. It was as if time had stopped here, freezing the hotel momentarily before the world fell apart. The absence of destruction was unsettling in its own way, too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath along with them. Noah and Charlotte moved swiftly, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins from their narrow escape. They made their way to the back of the building, where the maintenance access doors were located, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Noah's eyes darted around, still on high alert, as he checked each door and window, his hands trembling slightly as the intensity of the past hours began to catch up with him. Charlotte was beside him, her crowbar ready in case something, anything, unexpected lurked within the shadows. But with each room they entered, their relief grew. The hotel was empty, no soul, living or dead, had entered. The stillness of the Residence Inn was almost unnerving, but also a welcome reprieve from the constant nightmare outside. "Clear," Noah muttered, stepping back into the hallway after sweeping yet another room. His voice was low, but it carried a sense of cautious optimism. Charlotte nodded, her shoulders finally relaxing. "Clear here too," she said. They exchanged a look, a shared understanding passing between them. This place was safe for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Together, they secured the maintenance access and double-checked all the exits, ensuring every door and window was locked tight. The barricades they had set up in their last refuge were flimsy and makeshift at best. But here, the Residence Inn felt like a fortress, solid and secure, with larger rooms and kitchen facilities that could easily be used for cooking and storing supplies. As they regrouped with the others in the hotel's lobby, Noah allowed himself a rare moment of calm. He glanced around, taking in the high ceilings and comfortable couches that filled the space. It felt like they had found something close to home for the first time since the outbreak, if only temporarily. The relief was palpable. It washed over the group like a wave, their tense postures loosening, their eyes softening as the realization of safety settled in. "This place, it's perfect," Liz said quietly, breaking the silence. She was leaning against a pillar, her spear still clutched in one hand, but her shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. "It's like a fortress." Charlotte nodded in agreement. "We'll need to ration our supplies, but with the kitchens here and enough space to spread out, "We can last a while," she said, her voice steady though her exhaustion was apparent. Noah stepped to the window, peering at the darkening sky and the horrors lurking beyond their new sanctuary. The horde was still out there, moving in aimless, hungry circles, but the thick walls of the Residence Inn shielded them from that grim reality. For now, the apocalypse couldn't touch them here. He turned back to the group, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We'll make this place our stronghold," he said, his voice low but filled with quiet confidence. "At least for now, we're safe." For the first time in what felt like forever, the group let out a collective breath. It wasn't over. There was no telling what tomorrow would bring. But for tonight, the Residence Inn was theirs. And for tonight, that was enough. As the adrenaline of their escape began to wear off, the reality of their situation sank in. They had made it, but at what cost? The journey had been harrowing, and they had nearly lost everything. Charlotte found Noah in one of the upper-floor rooms, staring out the window at the zombie-infested street below. She touched his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You saved us," she said softly. "Without you, we wouldn't have made it." Noah turned to her, his eyes filled with exhaustion and resolve. "We saved us," he corrected. "Your strength, your ability to keep everyone calm, that's what got us here." A silent understanding passed between them as they stood there, looking out at the changed world. They had faced death together and come out the other side. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. "We should start fortifying," Noah said after a moment, his practical nature reasserting itself. "Block off the lower floors, set up a watch rotation." Charlotte nodded, mentally cataloging the supplies they had brought and what they would need. "I'll organize everyone into teams," she said. "We'll need to do a full inventory of what's here and start rationing immediately." As they moved to leave the room, Noah paused at the door. "Charlotte," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "I'm glad you're here. I couldn't do this without you." Charlotte felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a tiny spark of hope in the darkness surrounding them. "We're in this together," she replied, her voice firm with conviction. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a team." With renewed purpose, they descended into the lobby of the Residence Inn. The other survivors looked at them expectantly, fear and hope for war in their eyes. Noah and Charlotte exchanged glances, drawing strength from each other before addressing the group. "All right, everyone," Noah began, his voice carrying across the room. "We've made it this far, but our work is beginning. This place can be our fortress, our home, but only if we work together." Charlotte stepped forward, her presence calming. "We've all been through hell to get here," she added. "But we're alive, and we're together. That's what matters. Now, let's make this place safe." Chapter 7. New Allies. The first pale rays of sunlight had just begun to creep over the horizon when Noah found himself standing atop the roof of the Residence Inn, his silhouette framed against the slowly brightening sky. From his vantage point, Chicopee stretched out before him like a graveyard of memories, once familiar streets now reduced to a haunting maze of abandoned cars, debris, and shattered windows. The stillness was unnerving, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to stir. Noah's eyes swept across the landscape, his gaze lingering on the occasional shuffling figure of a lone zombie staggering aimlessly down the street. The eerie quiet was broken only by the faint groans of the undead, so distant they were almost swallowed by the dawn. For a moment, the peacefulness of the morning felt wrong, too calm for a world that had descended into chaos. He inhaled deeply, letting the crisp morning air fill his lungs, but even that carried the faint, rancid scent of decay. The world had changed beyond recognition, and so had he. Gone were the days of routine and normalcy. Every breath now carried the weight of survival, every sunrise a reminder of the countless challenges that awaited him and his group. From up here, everything seemed deceptively still, almost peaceful, but Noah knew better. Beneath the quiet lay danger, unseen threats that would soon come creeping from the shadows. Supplies were dwindling, the horde was growing, and their new sanctuary, as solid as it seemed, wouldn't hold forever. As the first full light of day broke across the ruined town, casting long shadows over the broken streets, Noah tightened his grip on the rusted pipe in his hand, his knuckles whitening. The challenges that lay ahead were no longer just about survival. They were about rebuilding some semblance of life in this new world, and the hardest part was yet to come. He scanned the horizon one last time, his heart heavy with the weight of what needed to be done. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The real test was about to begin. With one final glance at the empty streets below, Noah turned and descended the fire escape, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them in the light of day. In this world, morning didn't bring hope. It brought new dangers, and Noah knew they had only just begun to scrape the surface. Charlotte emerged from the rooftop access door, 2 steaming mugs in hand. "Thought you could use this," she said, offering Noah a cup of instant coffee. "Thanks," Noah replied, gratefully accepting the warm beverage. "Any movement down there?" Charlotte shook her head. "Nothing significant. It's almost too quiet." As they stood together in the stillness of the early morning, the silence between Noah and Charlotte was comfortable, almost comforting. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the rooftop of the Residence Inn, but the weight of the last few days clung to them like a shroud. Each breath they took seemed to carry the heaviness of survival, their minds never fully able to rest. Noah's eyes scanned the horizon, but his thoughts drifted back to the harrowing events that had led them here. The journey from the Hampton Inn felt like a distant nightmare. Though it had only been a few days, the memories were already etched into his bones. Every step had been filled with danger. The close calls with the undead, the narrow escapes, and the endless uncertainty that gnawed at them like a constant shadow. More than once he had thought they wouldn't make it, but somehow they had. Finding the Residence Inn, relatively untouched by the chaos that had engulfed the rest of the town, had been a rare stroke of luck. But Noah knew, deep down, that luck wouldn't last forever. They had worked tirelessly for the past 2 days to fortify the building. They had barricaded doors, secured windows, and scouted the nearby streets for anything they could use. But the truth was unavoidable. They couldn't need help to rely on the Residence Inn. Their supplies were dwindling. The few energy bars and water bottles they'd scavenged would only last them a little longer. And though the hotel had larger rooms and the security of thick walls, it wasn't enough. They were still just 2 people, and isolation was a slow death in this new world. Noah's thoughts returned to the present as the silence between them stretched. He glanced at Charlotte, her face unreadable as she stared out at the ruined landscape. He knew she was thinking the same thing. How long could they hold out here? How much longer could they pretend that they were safe? "We need to start thinking about venturing out again," Noah said, his voice breaking the silence but carrying the weight of their reality. His tone was measured, but the seriousness in his words hung heavy in the air. "We're going to need more supplies soon. Water, food, weapons, everything. We can't afford to wait." Charlotte didn't respond immediately, but Noah could see her jaw tense as she considered his words. They had barely had time to rest or a chance to process everything they had been through, and now the thought of leaving the hotel's relative safety felt like walking into a death trap. But she knew he was right. They both did. "And," Noah continued after a pause, "we should see if there are any other survivors in the area. We can't do this alone forever." The unspoken truth hung between them. Strength came in numbers. As much as they managed to survive independently, they needed help. More people meant more hands to defend their refuge, to scavenge, to plan. But it also meant more risk, more danger. Not everyone they found would be friendly. Not everyone would be trustworthy. In this world, the living could be just as dangerous as the dead. Charlotte finally turned to look at him, her eyes narrowing as she weighed the risks. "I know," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with a weariness that came from days of fighting for survival. "But we have to be smart about this. One wrong move out there, and we're done." Noah nodded. "We'll plan it carefully. We'll scout first, keep it quiet. But we can't stay here, and I hope it all works out. We need to take action. We need to be proactive." The seriousness of the situation pressed down on them like a physical weight. They had found a temporary sanctuary, but that's all it was, temporary. The world outside was still unforgiving, full of threats crashing down on them if they didn't move fast. The undead weren't their only problem. Supplies were scarce, and other survivors, desperate or dangerous, could be lurking in the shadows. We'll need to start tomorrow, Charlotte said, her tone final, before things get any worse. Noah glanced back out at the ruined streets, his mind already racing with plans, routes they could take, places they might search. But beneath it all, the uncertainty gnawed at him. Every step they took outside those walls was a gamble, and there were no guarantees in this world. Agreed, he replied softly, but his mind was already elsewhere, thinking of the challenges that lay ahead. He knew the risks, but doing nothing wasn't an option. They couldn't just survive anymore. They needed to thrive, to rebuild something in the ashes of what the world had become. And that meant facing the dangers outside head-on, whatever the cost. As they stood there, the quiet between them returned, but this time it was laced with a sense of purpose. They weren't just waiting anymore. They were preparing for what came next. Charlotte nodded in agreement. I've been thinking the same thing, but we should be careful. We don't know what or who is out there. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the street below. Noah and Charlotte rushed to the edge of the roof, peering down to see a small group of people running towards the hotel, pursued by a pack of zombies. "We've got to help them," Charlotte exclaimed, already moving towards the stairs. Noah hesitated for a split second, weighing the risks, but quickly followed. "All right, but we do this smart. Get the others up and armed. I'll head down to the lobby to let them in." As they descended, the hotel burst into action. The few survivors they had rescued during their relocation quickly armed themselves with makeshift weapons, golf clubs, kitchen knives, and anything else they could find. Noah reached the lobby just as the group outside hammered on the glass doors. He could see the fear in their eyes, the zombies closing in behind them. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door, ushering them inside before quickly securing it again. The newcomers collapsed on the lobby floor, gasping for air. Noah counted 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all looking worse for wear. "Thank you," one of the men said between breaths. He was older, with graying hair and the physique of someone who had seen his fair share of action. "I'm Frank, ex-police officer. We've been on the run for days." Noah nodded, extending a hand to help Frank up. "I'm Noah. We've got a safe setup here, but we need to move quickly. Those zombies outside might attract more." As if on cue, fists pounding on glass echoed through the lobby. The zombies had reached the doors, their decaying faces pressed against the windows. Charlotte arrived with the others, quickly assessing the situation. "Let's get everyone upstairs. We can do introductions once we're safe." The group hurried to the upper floors, barricading the stairwell behind them. In a conference room that had been converted into a makeshift command center, they gathered to catch their breath and assess the situation. Frank stepped forward, his expression hardened from the weight of leadership, but with a glint of cautious optimism in his eyes as he introduced the rest of his group. First was Sarah, a woman in her mid-40s with sun-weathered skin and hands calloused from years of working the earth. She wore a faded flannel shirt and well-worn jeans, a clear reminder of the life she had left behind as a local farmer. Her presence immediately struck Noah as invaluable, someone who understood how to grow food in a world where agriculture had collapsed overnight. Next came Tom and Lisa, a young couple who looked out of place in this brutal new world. In his mid-20s, Tom was tall and wiry, his dark hair messy and his face lined with exhaustion. Lisa, shorter with long brown hair tied back into a ponytail, clung to Tom's arm with a mixture of fear and determination. They had been on a road trip when the outbreak hit, their car filled with the remnants of that carefree life. Maps, camping gear, and snacks that now felt like relics of a distant past. Their bond was evident. They leaned on each other in a way that made Noah think they'd survived this long by sticking close. Finally, there was Alex, a teenager who couldn't have been more than 17. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his hands fidgeted constantly. His broad, nervous eyes darted around the room, never resting on anyone for too long. There was something fragile about him that made Noah worry whether he could handle the grim reality they faced. Still, Alex was here, alive, and that meant something. As Frank finished the introductions, the room fell into a brief silence. Each person carried their own scars from the outbreak, whether physical or emotional, and Noah could feel the weight of those burdens as they lingered in the air. But there was also potential in this group. They had skills, experiences, and most importantly, a will to survive. Noah nodded to each of them, his mind already contemplating the possibilities. Sarah's agricultural expertise could be a game changer. At the same time, Tom and Lisa's youthful energy and resourcefulness would be critical on supply runs. Alex might be young and anxious, but Noah had seen that fear often hid strength in those who hadn't yet had a chance to prove themselves. "Well," Noah said, breaking the silence, "it looks like we've got ourselves a real team now." The others nodded, their faces a mix of relief and uncertainty. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in days, Noah felt a flicker of hope. "We've been moving from place to place," Frank explained, "but supplies are running low, and we've lost people. When we saw this place, we thought it might be our last chance." Noah and Charlotte exchanged glances. They had been cautious about letting in new people, but the skills and knowledge this group brought could be crucial for their survival. "Well, you're safe now," Charlotte said, her voice warm and reassuring. "We don't have much, but we're willing to share what we have." As the day progressed, the new arrivals settled in, and the dynamics of the group began to shift. Frank's experience as a police officer proved invaluable in organizing security rotations and developing evacuation plans. Sarah immediately set to work planning a rooftop garden, her expertise in farming offering a glimmer of hope for sustainable food production. Noah worked closely with Frank to reinforce the hotel's defenses. As they worked, Frank shared stories of his time on the force, and Noah opened up about his own background. "You know, I never thought my handyman skills would be saving lives," Noah chuckled as they finished boarding up a window. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "In times like these, every skill counts. You've done a good job keeping these people alive." Meanwhile, Charlotte had taken Alex under her wing. The teenager's initial nervousness had given way to a quiet determination, and she discovered he had a knack for technology. "I used to build computers in my spare time," Alex explained as he tinkered with an old radio. "If I can get this working, we might be able to pick up broadcasts from other survivors." Charlotte smiled encouragingly. "That's brilliant, Alex. Keep at it." As the sun began to set, the group gathered for a communal dinner, a meager affair of canned goods and stale bread. Still, it felt like a feast after days of uncertainty. Noah stood up, clearing his throat. "I know we're all still getting to know each other, but I want to say how grateful I am that we've found each other. Each of you brings something valuable to our group. Together, I believe we can survive and maybe even start rebuilding." Charlotte nodded in agreement. "We've all been through hell, but we're not alone anymore. This hotel isn't just a shelter, it's becoming a home." The mood in the room lifted, and a sense of cautious optimism spread through the group. As they continued to eat and share stories, plans began to form. Sarah and Tom discussed the possibility of clearing nearby lots for farming. Lisa, who had worked as a nurse, started inventorying their medical supplies and planning first aid training sessions. Later that night, Noah and Charlotte met on the roof again, looking out over the quiet town. "Do you think we made the right call?" Noah asked, his voice low. "Letting them in?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment before responding. "I do. We couldn't have survived on our own forever. And did you see how everyone's spirits lifted? For the first time since this all started, I feel like we have a real chance." Noah nodded, feeling the weight of leadership on his shoulders. "You're right, but it also means more people to protect, more mouths to feed. And more hands to help, more minds to solve problems," Charlotte countered. "We're stronger together, Noah." As they stood there, the distant sound of a zombie's moan drifted up from the streets below, a stark reminder of the world they now lived in. But inside the Residence Inn, a community was forming, bound by shared experiences and the will to survive. Noah took a deep breath, his resolve strengthening. "All right, then. Tomorrow, we start planning our first major supply run. We'll need to hit the Home Depot for materials to reinforce our defenses, and we should check out that Aldi for any remaining food." Charlotte smiled, her eyes reflecting the determination in Noah's voice. "I'll work with Frank to organize teams. We'll make this work, Noah, one day at a time." Chapter 8. Scavenging for Supplies. The early morning sun hung low in the sky, casting long, creeping shadows across the cracked pavement of the Residence Inn's parking lot. A faint mist clung to the air, the remnants of the night's coolness lingering, mixing with the uneasy tension that settled over the group. Noah stood at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand tightening around the makeshift weapon. Behind him, Charlotte was methodically adjusting her gear, her movements quick but deliberate, the nervous energy barely contained. The rest of their newly formed group, Frank, Sarah, Tom, Lisa, and Alex, gathered close, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and quiet fear. This wasn't just another scavenging mission. It was the first since they'd claimed the Residence Inn as their stronghold, and it would test everything they had built over the past few days. The stakes felt higher now. The thin line between life and death had never been so sharp, and Noah could sense the weight of that reality pressing down on each of them. Once bustling with guests and hotel staff, the parking lot was now an abandoned wasteland. Overturned shopping carts, shattered glass, and debris from the chaos that had torn through Chicopee littered the ground. The air was heavy with the scent of rot, subtle but ever-present, a grim reminder of what lurked beyond their temporary sanctuary. Noah glanced at Charlotte, who met his gaze with a silent nod. They had prepared for this moment, but preparation only went so far in a world that had become unpredictable and dangerous. His heart thudded in his chest as he turned to address the group, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. "All right, we know the risks," he began, eyes locking with each group member. Frank stood tall, his leadership instincts sharp, while Sarah's face was grimly determined. Tom and Lisa, though young and visibly shaken, looked ready to face what was coming. Alex, the teenager, fidgeted nervously, his wide eyes darting between the others. Still, he had shown up, and that was enough for now. "We need food, water, and weapons," Noah continued. "And we can't stay hidden in that hotel forever. This mission isn't just about supplies. It's about seeing what's left out there." Who's left? The group had decided to split into two teams. Noah would lead one team to Home Depot, while Charlotte would take the other to Aldi. Frank, the ex-police officer, spoke up, his authoritative tone commanding attention. "I'll go with Noah's team. We'll need the heavy lifting for construction materials." Sarah, the farmer, joined Charlotte's group. "I can help identify the most nutritious and long-lasting food supplies," she offered, her practical knowledge already proving invaluable. As they prepared to depart, Noah couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and concern. They had come so far since the chaotic days at the Hampton Inn, but the dangers outside their walls remained ever present. The two teams set out, each taking a different vehicle they had secured while moving to the Residence Inn. Noah's team headed west on Memorial Drive. At the same time, Charlotte's group took a more circuitous route to avoid potential zombie hordes they had spotted in previous days. Noah's truck rumbled down the eerily quiet street, the silence broken only by the occasional groan of a distant zombie. As they approached Home Depot, the vast parking lot came into view, littered with abandoned cars and the shambling forms of the undead. "Okay, folks," Noah said, his voice low but firm. "We're going to clear a path to the entrance. Remember, quick and quiet, no unnecessary risks." With practiced efficiency, the team dispatched the nearest zombies using makeshift weapons they had crafted back at the hotel. Noah led the charge, his movements fluid and purposeful, a far cry from the maintenance worker he had been just weeks ago. Inside the store, the group spread out, grabbing carts and filling them with essential supplies. Noah focused on tools and building materials, knowing they would need to continue fortifying the Residence Inn. Frank kept watch, his police training evident in his alert stance and quick reflexes. Meanwhile, Charlotte's team arrived at Aldi, finding the smaller store easier to secure. Sarah's expertise proved invaluable as she quickly identified the most nutritious and long-lasting food items. Charlotte coordinated the effort, her hospitality training translating seamlessly into crisis management. As they loaded their vehicle with canned goods, dried foods, and other essentials, Charlotte heard a noise from the back of the store. "Everyone freeze," she whispered, her hand cautiously raised. The group tensed, listening intently. The sound came again, a soft whimper, distinctly human. Charlotte exchanged glances with Sarah, both women recognizing the moral dilemma they now faced. Do they investigate, potentially risking their safety, or ignore it and possibly leave someone in need? "We can't just leave," Charlotte decided, her compassion winning. Sarah, you and Tom keep loading. I'll check it out with Mike. Cautiously, Charlotte and Mike, the tech-savvy teenager, made their way to the back of the store. There, huddled behind a stack of boxes, they found a young woman, trembling and clearly terrified. "It's okay," Charlotte soothed, her voice gentle. "We're here to help. Are you alone?" The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I've been hiding for days," she choked out. "I thought everyone was gone." Charlotte helped the woman to her feet, introducing herself and explaining their situation. As they made their way back to the group, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and anxiety. They had saved a life, but they had also added another mouth to feed and protect. Back at Home Depot, Noah's team had just finished loading the last of their supplies when they heard a low, guttural moan that sent a chill down their spines. From behind a nearby building, a horde of zombies staggered into view, drawn by the noise of their activity. Their dead eyes locked onto the group, and the air filled with shuffling feet and hungry groans. "Everyone, to the truck!" Noah shouted, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. The group sprang into action, their hearts racing as they scrambled to secure their haul. Each second felt like an eternity as the undead advanced, their decayed forms moving faster than they had hoped. Frank, always quick under pressure, pulled out the handgun he had taken off a dead cop during his journeys. He had no love for guns, but in this world, survival trumped everything. Without hesitation, he aimed and fired. The sharp crack of the shot echoed through the lot, and the first zombie's head snapped back. A bullet lodged deep in its skull. The creature collapsed in a heap, but the others kept coming, undeterred. Sarah swung a shovel at a zombie closing in on her, the force of the impact sending it stumbling. But it wasn't enough. The creature snarled and lunged again, its rotting fingers inches from her. Sarah then shoved the tip of the shovel in the zombie's mouth, the shovel penetrating towards the back of its head. The zombie fell backward, making a loud grunting noise. Sarah then jumped on the bursting of the shovel as if she was digging a hole in hard dirt. The shovel split the zombie's head in half, the top of the head and brain matter rolling backward in a pool of its own black oozing blood. "Move! Get to the truck!" Noah shouted, smashing his crowbar into a zombie's skull. The wet crack of bone and flesh filled the air as the creature fell limp. But for every one they took down, two more seemed to take its place. The horde was growing, their numbers multiplying as they poured in from every direction. Tom and Lisa, their faces pale with fear, were struggling to haul the last crate of supplies into the truck. His hands trembling, Alex clutched his knife as he kept his eyes on the approaching horde, panic flashing across his face. Frank fired again, dropping two more zombies with clean headshots, but the horde was closing in fast. "We're running out of time, Noah!" Frank shouted, reloading his handgun with quick, practiced movements. He fired another shot, taking out a zombie that had gotten too close to the truck. Noah gritted his teeth, slamming his crowbar into the chest of another undead, sending it reeling backward. "We need to go. Now!" Sarah and Frank were the first to jump into the truck, panting as they secured the supplies. Tom and Lisa threw the last crate into the truck bed, their faces etched with desperation as they clambered in. Alex, still frozen with fear, hesitated for a moment too long. "Alex, move!" Noah yelled, just as a zombie lunged at the teenager, its decayed hands reaching for him. In a burst of adrenaline, Alex threw himself into the truck, barely escaping the grasping hands of the undead. Frank fired his final round, dropping the zombie inches from the truck's rear before slamming the door shut. Noah vaulted into the driver's seat, his heart pounding as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, the truck tore out of the parking lot, the horde swarming behind them, their hungry groans fading into the distance. Noah's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his mind still racing from the chaos. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the others. Sarah was catching her breath, Tom and Lisa huddled close, and Alex sat wide-eyed, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Frank lowered his handgun, his face grim and covered in sweat. They had made it, barely. The weight of survival hung heavy in the air, but the relief was fleeting. Noah knew the world outside was relentless. This time, they had escaped. But there would always be a next time, and luck was something they could only rely on for a while. As both teams returned to the Residence Inn, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on Noah and Charlotte. They had succeeded in their mission, but at significant risk. The close calls were a stark reminder of the constant danger that lurked beyond their walls. Reunited at the hotel, the two leaders debriefed their teams. Charlotte introduced the rescued survivor, Emily, to the group. Noah nodded, understanding Charlotte's decision, but recognizing the additional strain it would put on their resources. "We did well today," Noah addressed the group, his voice tinged with pride and caution. "But we need to be more innovative and more efficient. We can't risk these close calls every time we need supplies." Charlotte stepped forward, her mind already working on solutions. "We should start thinking long-term. Sarah, could we start a small garden on the hotel roof? And Frank, we need to work on a better early warning system for zombie activity in the area." As the group dispersed to unload their hard-won supplies, Noah and Charlotte found a quiet moment alone. The weight of leadership hung heavy on their shoulders, but they also felt a sense of accomplishment in how far they had come. "We're going to need to ration these supplies carefully," Noah mused, running a hand through his hair. "And we need to train more people for these runs. We can't keep risking our most experienced members every time." Charlotte nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Agreed. And we need to start thinking about more than just survival. These people need hope, something to live for beyond just making it to the next day." Chapter 9. Harmony Within. "We've come a long way together," Noah began, his voice steady. "Each of us has a stake in this community, and each voice matters. We need to decide whether to bring in the new group Sarah spotted." The room erupted into a cacophony of opinions. Some, like Emily, the woman they had rescued from Aldi, argued passionately for helping the newcomers. Others sided with Frank, citing the strain on their resources and the potential security risk. Charlotte stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "I know we're all scared, but remember why we're here. We survived because we helped each other. Are we really going to abandon that principle now?" Her words resonated, and the mood in the room shifted slowly. When the vote was called, the majority offered sanctuary to the new group. As the meeting dispersed, Noah pulled Charlotte aside. "That was some speech," he said, admiration clear in his voice. Charlotte smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I meant every word, but Frank's not wrong about the risks. We'll need to be careful." The following day, the air was thick with unease as Noah and Sarah prepared to lead a small team into the heart of the ruined city. The mission was simple: contact the new group they'd heard rumors about and offer them sanctuary. But nothing about the world they lived in now was simple. The streets of Chicopee were a graveyard of shattered lives, and every venture beyond the safety of the Residence Inn felt like stepping into the jaws of death. As they set out, the eerie quiet of the streets clung to them like a second skin. Abandoned cars, their windows smashed and interiors looted, littered the road like the bones of a forgotten time. The once bustling city was now a labyrinth of debris, overturned shopping carts, and scattered belongings. Every sound, the crunch of their boots on broken glass, the wind stirring the trash, felt magnified, threatening to betray their presence to the ever-lurking undead. The deeper they ventured, the heavier the air became, thick with tension and the sour stench of rot. The distant groans of zombies echoed through the empty streets, a low, mournful wail that kept the team on high alert. Noah's grip tightened on his crowbar, his knuckles white as his eyes scanned every alley, every shadow. Beside him, Sarah moved with the same cautious precision, her shovel ready to strike. They knew the undead could appear any time, shambling behind wrecked cars or broken storefronts. As they neared the marketplace, a place that had once been filled with life but was now silent as a tomb, the distant moans grew louder and the tension in the air thickened. Their eyes darted around the deserted stalls, many still stocked with rotting fruit and wilted vegetables, a cruel reminder of the life that had once been here. Then they found them. A group of survivors, huddled in the back of a rusting delivery truck, their faces pale and gaunt with hunger and fear. The doors had been barricaded from the inside. Still, the survivors had been too terrified to move, too scared to face the horrors that waited beyond their makeshift shelter. Among them were 3 children, their faces smeared with dirt, their wide eyes reflecting a mix of hope and terror as they watched Noah and Sarah approach. Noah stepped forward. His voice was soft but firm. "We're from the Residence Inn," he said, crouching to meet their gaze. "We've built a safe place. We can take you there." The adults in the group exchanged wary glances, their hollowed cheeks and sunken eyes betraying just how desperate they were. The children huddled closer to their parents, their tiny bodies trembling in the cold morning air. One of the men finally nodded, his voice hoarse. "If you can get us out of here, we'll come." The journey back was suffocating in its tension. The survivors moved in a tight formation, the children clinging to their parents as they navigated through the broken streets. Every sound, the scrape of a boot against concrete, the clatter of debris kicked aside, felt like it would summon the undead. The groans in the distance seemed to grow louder and closer with each passing minute. The shadows stretched long across the ground, dark and foreboding, as if they were alive and waiting to swallow the group whole. Noah's heart pounded in his chest as they pressed on, and the cold sweat on the back of his neck was a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Every alley felt like a trap. Every abandoned car is a potential hiding place for the undead. He could almost hear the quiet growls of zombies lurking just out of sight, their milky eyes watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, just as they rounded a corner, a faint rustling came from a nearby alley. Noah's breath caught in his throat. His eyes snapped to the source, and for a moment he was sure he saw movement, shadows shifting unnaturally. He raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. Sarah stepped beside him, her shovel at the ready, her body tense. For a heart-stopping moment, the world was still. The air was thick with anticipation, the distant groans of zombies the only sound breaking the silence. And then, nothing. The shadows were just shadows. Noah exhaled slowly, lowering his hand, and they continued forward. As they neared the Residence Inn, the survivors' pace quickened, a new energy pushing them forward. For the first time in what felt like years, they saw hope. The towering structure of the hotel loomed in the distance, its walls a beacon in the sea of chaos that surrounded them. Noah felt a swell of pride in his chest as the hotel appeared. They had built something here, something substantial, a place where people could live, not just survive. The Residence Inn had become more than just a shelter. It symbolized defiance in a world gone mad. But even as they approached the safety of its walls, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness outside wasn't finished with them yet. Hope was fragile in this world, and the horrors lurking in the shadows never stayed silent for long. The new survivors' integration was anything but smooth. What had begun as a hopeful expansion of their tight-knit group quickly devolved into a tense balancing act. Living spaces were rearranged, food rations reallocated, and the delicate equilibrium the original group had maintained was thrown into disarray. Noah and Charlotte, who had once led a relatively harmonious community, now played the roles of mediators and diplomats, constantly putting out fires before they could spread. Disputes erupted daily, each one more bitter than the last. The old guard, the original survivors, resented the newcomers, seeing them as intruders in a space they had fought so hard to secure. Meanwhile, weary and desperate, the new group felt the sting of being treated as outsiders despite being promised sanctuary. Noah and Charlotte's leadership had shifted from organizing supply runs and fortifying defenses to navigating a complex web of personalities, grievances, and clashing interests. They were no longer just fighting the undead. They were battling the creeping distrust within their own walls, and it was wearing them down. One evening, as Noah made his usual rounds, checking the perimeter and ensuring their defenses were holding, he overheard sharp, angry, and hushed voices. He stopped, just out of sight, listening carefully. 2 original survivors were locked in a heated conversation, their words brimming with frustration. "It's not fair," one hissed, barely keeping his voice low. "We were here first. Why should we have to give up our comforts for them?" Noah felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a minor complaint. It was a symptom of something much deeper that had been brewing since the new survivors arrived. The sense of ownership and entitlement had begun to poison their community's well. The original survivors, those who had fortified the residence inn, built its defenses and shared in the hardship, now felt that their sacrifices gave them more claim to the resources, safety, and leadership. Noah leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He understood their frustration. He shared it in part. But the stark reality was that this wasn't just their home anymore. They were trying to build something bigger than just a safe haven. They were trying to create a functioning society amid chaos. And societies, no matter how small, required cooperation, compromise, and a delicate balance of power. When Noah finally stepped into view, the two men fell silent, their faces flushed with anger and surprise. He held up a hand, signaling that he had heard enough. "I get it," Noah said, his voice calm but firm, the weight of his words hanging in the cool night air. "You were here first. You built this place. You bled for it. But if we start thinking like that, if we divide ourselves into us and them, we won't last another week." The two men exchanged glances, their anger tempered by Noah's steady tone. However, the resentment was still there, simmering just below the surface. "These new survivors," Noah continued, "are not here to take what's ours. They're here because they need the same thing we needed when we first arrived: safety, a chance to rebuild." He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto theirs. "We have to start thinking long-term. If we can't integrate or grow, then we're just delaying the inevitable. This world doesn't care about fairness. It's about survival. And the only way we're going to survive is together." Noah knew it wasn't a perfect speech. It wouldn't instantly dissolve the tension that had built up over the past few days. But it was the truth, and that was all he could offer them. The men said nothing, their frustration still evident, but the sharp edges of their hostility seemed to soften. They nodded stiffly before walking away, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As Noah watched them disappear into the shadows of the hotel, he couldn't help but feel the weight of leadership pressing down on him harder than ever before. They were walking a fine line, trying to create something that resembled a functioning society, but with all the old grievances and entitlements that had plagued the world before it fell apart. He knew that tomorrow would bring more disputes and more complaints, but for tonight at least, the fragile peace held. And that, in this new world, was a victory in itself. Noah's heart sank, and a blood-curdling scream tore through the night air. "Zombies!" The cry came from the eastern side of the hotel. The petty squabbles were instantly forgotten as everyone sprang into action. Noah raced towards the source of the commotion, his heart pounding. He arrived to find a section of their makeshift wall had given way, allowing a horde of the undead to pour through. "Charlotte!" he shouted, spotting her organizing a group of defenders. "Get everyone inside. We need to seal the breach." The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and raw terror, the air thick with the stench of death and the frantic sounds of battle. Noah's heart pounded in his chest as the undead pressed closer, their guttural moans growing louder as they closed in from all sides. The world narrowed to the immediate task at hand: survival. Without thinking, Noah found himself side by side with Frank. Their earlier disagreements and tensions vanished in the face of the common enemy bearing down on them. They moved in sync, an unspoken understanding passing between them with every swing and shot. Frank's background in law enforcement showed in his precise movements, his handgun, taken from a dead cop during his journeys, firing off rounds with surgical efficiency. Each shot was deliberate, each bullet finding its mark in the decaying skulls of the undead, dropping them with brutal finality. Noah, resourceful as ever, wielded a crowbar with both hands, the weight of it familiar now after countless battles. The sickening thud of metal meeting bone echoed through the chaos as he swung with all his strength, sending a zombie crashing to the ground, its skull caved in. Another lunged at him, its rotting hands outstretched, but Frank was faster. A single, clean shot to the temple, and the creature crumpled before it even reached them. From the corner of his eye, Noah caught a glimpse of Sarah. She led a group armed with whatever they could find: garden tools, kitchen knives, anything sharp or heavy enough to fend off the relentless horde. Her farming strength, once used to till the land and harvest crops, was now put to grim use. With a fierce yell, she swung a shovel with deadly precision, the flat of the blade slamming into a zombie's skull with a sickening crunch. The creature's head snapped back, its body collapsing into the dirt, twitching once before going still. Sarah didn't pause. Sweat poured down her face, her muscles straining as she swung the shovel again, this time catching another zombie in the chest, sending it stumbling back into the arms of one of her comrades. The group fought as one, their makeshift weapons cutting into the mass of undead, pushing the horde back foot by foot. Lisa, one of the younger survivors, wielded a kitchen knife, her hands shaking as she drove it into the neck of a snarling zombie. The blade sank deep, black blood pouring from the wound, but the creature kept coming. Before it could reach her, Sarah brought her shovel down on its head, splitting its skull with a brutal blow. "Keep pushing!" Noah shouted, his voice hoarse from the exertion. He smashed his crowbar into the face of another zombie, its jaw snapping with a grotesque crack. The creature stumbled, and Noah didn't hesitate. He drove the crowbar down again, ending it with a final, sickening thud. Frank's gun barked again, taking down 2 more zombies that had broken through the line. His movements were sharp and controlled, but he was still tired. The undead seemed endless, their numbers overwhelming, and the pressure was mounting. The fight was a desperate dance of survival, a blur of swinging weapons, gnashing teeth, and the ever-present groans of the undead. Blood, thick, dark, and foul, splattered the ground and covered their hands as they fought tooth and nail to keep the zombies at bay. Noah's arms burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. One wrong move, one slip, and it would all be over. Frank's once steady aim faltered as he ran low on ammunition, each shot becoming more deliberate, more precious. And still the horde pressed closer. But slowly, they began to turn the tide. Fueled by sheer will and desperation, Sarah's group flanked the horde, cutting through their numbers with a brutal efficiency that belied their inexperience. The makeshift weapons might have been crude, but they became instruments of survival in their hands. Sarah's shovel was a blur of motion, each swing bringing down another undead, her face set in grim determination. "Noah!" Frank called, his voice urgent. Noah turned just in time to see a zombie lunging at him from the side, its decayed teeth bared. With a grunt, he swung the crowbar in a wide arc, the metal connecting with the creature's skull in a wet, crunching blow. It collapsed at his feet, twitching before finally going still. The battle raged on, but the group's combined efforts began to turn the tide. The horde was thinning, its numbers dwindling as more zombies fell under the relentless assault. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last undead collapsed, their bodies twitching one final time before falling still. The zombies' moans faded into an eerie silence, broken only by the survivors' heavy breathing. Noah stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his crowbar slick with blood. Frank was beside him, his face grim, his gun lowered, the last few bullets still loaded in the chamber. Drenched in sweat and blood, Sarah wiped her brow with the back of her hand, her shovel resting on her shoulder like a battle-worn warrior. The horde was beaten for now, but Noah knew there would be more. There always were. Charlotte's voice rang out over the din, coordinating the defense and evacuation with remarkable clarity. Even amid battle, Noah couldn't help but admire her composure. The fight seemed to last forever, but finally, the tide began to turn. With a Herculean effort, Noah and Frank wedged a heavy vending machine into the breach, stemming the flow of zombies. The remaining undead were dispatched with grim efficiency. As the last zombie collapsed to the ground with a final, grotesque twitch, an eerie silence blanketed the hotel grounds. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and the adrenaline that had surged through Noah's veins during the battle now ebbed, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. He stood in the middle of the carnage, surrounded by the broken, bloodied remains of both the undead and the living. The once sturdy grounds of the Residence Inn, their fortress, were now a graveyard. Bodies lay scattered across the blood-soaked earth. Some of the undead, but too many were their own. The makeshift weapons and hastily assembled defenses had barely held, and though they had survived the onslaught, the cost had been devastating. Noah's gaze settled on the still form of one of the children they had recently welcomed, his tiny body lying motionless near the building's entrance. His chest tightened painfully at the sight, the weight of failure pressing down on him with brutal force. It was a cruel reminder that, in this world, no one, not even the young and innocent, was genuinely safe. The sight sent a wave of grief and rage through him, but there was no time for those feelings now. The living needed him. He forced himself to look away, taking stock of the others. Several more of their group lay dead, their lifeless bodies twisted in unnatural angles. Faces he had come to know, people who had fought alongside him. The survivors who remained upright were battered, bloodied, and weary beyond belief. Some had already dropped to their knees beside the fallen, their tears mixing with the blood-soaked ground. Others stood in stunned silence, their eyes hollow with grief and shock. Slowly they gathered in the hotel lobby, moving as if in a daze. The once bustling heart of their refuge was now filled with the heavy weight of mourning. The survivors huddled together, seeking comfort in their shared loss, but the atmosphere was thick with despair. Noah stood before them, feeling the crushing weight of leadership pressing down on him harder than ever. Every death, every sacrifice felt like a failure, a responsibility he couldn't escape. He scanned the faces of those who had fought and survived, their expressions haunted by the trauma of what they had just endured. Frank stood near the back, his gun still in his hand, his face grim and lined with exhaustion. Sarah was clutching her bloodied shovel, her eyes distant as she stared at the floor. Tom and Lisa huddled together, their hands entwined as they leaned on each other for support. Noah's throat was dry, and his voice was hoarse as he began to speak. His words were slow and measured, each carrying the weight of what had been lost. "We've lost good people tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, the gravity of the situation pressing down on the room. He paused, his eyes scanning the group, taking in their battered, bloodied faces. They were all looking to him, their leader, to say anything that might help them make sense of the devastation. He cleared his throat, fighting back the raw emotion threatening to crack his voice. "But we're still here. We're still fighting." It felt hollow, almost cruel to say. They had survived, but at what cost? And how much longer could they hold on before they, too, fell? He saw the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question. For how long? Noah took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. "We can't let this be the end, not after everything we've been through." His voice strengthened as he spoke, fueled by the raw determination that had kept him alive this long. "We owe it to them, those we lost, to keep going, to keep fighting." The words felt like a thin shield against the crushing reality they faced. The undead would come again, more people would die, but it was all he had to offer them, hope, fragile as it was. He didn't have the answers, but he had his resolve, and right now that was the only thing keeping them all from falling apart. He glanced at the doorway, at the blood-streaked ground beyond it, and steeled himself for what lay ahead. "We rebuild, we reinforce, and we make sure this never happens again." The survivors nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of grief and reluctant determination. They were broken, yes, but not beyond repair. Not yet. Noah could see it in their eyes. They would mourn the dead, but they would not lie down with them. Not tonight. As they dispersed to tend to their wounded and fortify their defenses, Noah stayed behind, his gaze fixed on the doorway where the child had fallen. He felt the weight of every life lost tonight like a stone in his chest, but he couldn't afford to falter. Not when they needed him to be strong. The night had been burdensome, the price had been high, but they were still standing. And as long as they were still standing, there was hope. However fragile, however fleeting, it was hope. Charlotte stepped up beside him, her presence a comfort. "What happened tonight? It brought us together. Old and new, we fought as one. That's how we'll survive." Her words resonated, and Noah saw nods of agreement ripple through the crowd. Even Frank, his face etched with sorrow, gave a solemn nod. Noah and Charlotte found a quiet moment alone as the group dispersed to tend to the wounded and reinforce their defenses. "Do you think we can keep this up?" Noah asked, the doubt he usually kept hidden creeping into his voice. Charlotte took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We have to. For them, for us. We've built more than just a shelter here, Noah. We've built a home." Noah squeezed her hand in return, drawing strength from her conviction. He felt a flicker of hope as they looked out over their battered but unbroken community. The road ahead would be hard, but they would face it together. In the days that followed, The Residence Inn transformed. The attack had shaken them, but it had also united them. Old grievances were set aside as everyone worked tirelessly to strengthen their defenses and care for one another. Noah watched with pride as Sarah taught the newcomers about her plans for a rooftop garden. At the same time, Frank organized combat training for anyone willing to learn. The tech-savvy teenager, Alex, worked on rigging up an early warning system using salvaged electronics. As the sun set on another day of rebuilding, Noah found Charlotte on the roof, gazing out at the changed world around them. "Penny for your thoughts," he asked, echoing her words from what felt like a lifetime ago. Charlotte turned to him, a small smile on her face. "Just thinking about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." Noah nodded, understanding the mix of hope and trepidation in her voice. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, all of us." As they stood there, watching the fading light paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Noah felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since the world ended. They had found harmony within their walls, a fragile but precious thing, and they would fight with everything they had to preserve it. Chapter 10. Securing the Future. The sun crept over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the fortified parking lot of the Residence Inn. The world outside looked deceptively peaceful, the golden light spilling across the desolate streets of Chicopee as if to wash away the horrors of the night before. But Noah knew better. He stood on the roof, eyes scanning the horizon for any movement, his body tense despite the calm. The past few weeks had been a blur of survival, fortifying their temporary shelter, building barricades, scavenging for supplies. They had managed to turn the Residence Inn into something that resembled a home. But after last night, after what they had lost, it felt fragile. Too fragile. The weight of the recent battle hung heavy in the air. Noah could still see the blood-soaked ground, the bodies of their fallen comrades etched into his memory, the young boy especially. His broad, hopeful eyes, now closed forever. They had fought hard, but the cost had been devastating, and the silence that lingered now was not comforting. It was ominous, as if the world held its breath for the next wave of death. "Penny for your thoughts." Charlotte's voice cut through his reverie, pulling him back from the grim thoughts in his mind. He hadn't heard her approach, but she stood beside him, with a steaming mug of coffee. It was a small luxury they had managed to scavenge on their last supply run, and in this world, small luxuries meant everything. Noah took the mug with a nod of thanks, the warmth seeping through the ceramic and into his cold hands. He raised it to his lips, savoring the bitter taste that spread across his tongue. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Almost. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he said, his voice low, as he stared at the ruins of Chicopee. "And how far we still have to go." The past weeks have been a constant struggle for survival, and last night was the clearest reminder yet that no matter how hard they fought, no matter how many defenses they built, the world outside was relentless. The horde had nearly broken through and lost too many good people. They didn't have to worry about just the undead anymore. It was the cracks forming within their own group. Grief had a way of eroding the strongest foundations. Charlotte sighed softly, her breath visible in the cool morning air. She followed his gaze across the landscape, her eyes clouded with the same unspoken weight. "We've made it this far," she said, her voice still tinged with wariness. "We'll keep going." But Noah didn't respond immediately. His mind was still back there, back in the battle, hearing the screams, feeling the heat of the fight, seeing the boy fall. The boy who had barely known this new world, who had looked up to Noah with trust and hope. Noah had promised him safety, and now that promise felt like ash in his mouth. "We have to," he finally said, his voice a little more challenging, the weight of leadership pressing down on him like an anchor. "But we can't afford another night like the last. We barely made it. If we lose more people—" His words trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. One more lousy fight like that wouldn't just be bodies they'd lose, it would be hope. And without hope, their fortress of walls and weapons would crumble from the inside out. Charlotte glanced at him, her jaw tightening. She knew it, too. They had made it through the night, but their losses were already taking a toll. The group was fractured, grieving, and scared. The dead weren't the only danger they faced anymore. Despair was creeping in, threatening to unravel everything they'd worked so hard to build. "We need to reinforce, regroup," Noah continued, his mind already racing ahead, thinking about what must be done. "We can't let last night happen again. We need more supplies, more weapons, more of everything." Charlotte nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll take some of the others on a run today. We'll see what we can find." Noah took another sip of coffee, the warmth doing little to soothe the growing chill in his chest. He knew they'd survive today, but tomorrow? Tomorrow was always uncertain. Noah's grip tightened around the mug as the sun rose higher, spreading its deceptive warmth over the devastated landscape. They had fought for their sanctuary and bled for it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming, something they weren't ready for. And when it came, would they still be standing? Their moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of Frank's whistle from below. It was time for the morning meeting. As they made their way down, Noah couldn't help but marvel at their implemented changes. The lobby, once a place of temporary comfort for travelers, had been transformed into a command center. Maps of Chicopee and the surrounding areas covered the walls, marked with potential scavenging locations and danger zones. The survivors gathered around, their faces a mix of determination and wariness. Noah cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "All right, folks, we've got a lot to cover today. First, I want to thank everyone for their hard work securing the perimeter. The new fencing has already proven its worth." Charlotte stepped forward, her voice calm and reassuring. "We've also made progress on our food situation. Sarah's rooftop garden is thriving, and we've set up a small hydroponics system in one of the conference rooms." A murmur of approval rippled through the group. Noah continued. "Now, on to our next challenge. We've been hearing reports of other survivor groups in the area. Some are friendly, some are not so much. We need to decide how to approach this." Frank, the ex-police officer, spoke up. "We can't just open our doors to everyone. We've got limited resources as it is." Sarah, the farmer, countered, "But we can't turn our backs on people in need. That's not who we are." The debate raged on, with valid points on both sides. Noah listened intently, his mind working to find a solution that satisfied everyone. Finally, he held up his hand for silence. "Here's what we're going to do," Noah began, his voice firm, carrying the weight of leadership but tempered with an understanding tone. The room fell silent, every eye on him as the survivors gathered around. The seriousness of the situation hung in the air. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about maintaining control, about ensuring their fragile sanctuary didn't fall apart from within. "We're going to establish a screening process," Noah continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting each person's eyes. "Anyone who wants to join us must prove they can contribute. No exceptions. We'll give people a chance, but we'll also be cautious. We can't afford to let our guard down, not now." He turned to Charlotte, his tone steady, but leaving no room for debate. "Charlotte, I want you to lead this initiative. Your people's skills are going to be crucial in making this work. We need someone who can read between the lines and judge character as much as skill." Charlotte nodded, her mind racing with the logistics of what needed to be done. She'd seen the dangers of bringing in the wrong people, and trust had to be earned in a world as broken as this one. "We can use the conference center as a quarantine zone," she said, calm and decisive. "It's separated from the main building, so we can keep newcomers isolated until they pose no threat. No one integrates until we know for sure they're safe." The plan was taking shape, but there needed to be more time to linger. As the meeting progressed, the conversation shifted to broader issues. Their survival wasn't just about keeping people out. It was about expanding, fortifying, and building something sustainable. "We need to widen our scavenging range," Noah continued, his tone urgent. "Our supplies are limited. We must push further into the city, maybe even the surrounding areas. We need food, weapons, and anything reinforcing our defenses." Standing off to the side, Frank crossed his arms, nodding in agreement. "We'll have to send teams further than ever before. It's risky, but we're running out of options." "And we can't rely on isolation forever," Charlotte added. "We need to consider establishing contact with other survivor groups. It's a gamble, but could provide us with allies and trade opportunities." Noah turned to Alex, the young, tech-savvy teenager who had been working tirelessly on their communication systems. His face was pale, but there was a quiet determination behind his eyes. "Alex, how's the radio coming along?" Alex straightened, clearly proud of his progress. "I've been rigging up a long-range system. If I can get the right parts, we'll be able to reach other groups. If they're out there, we might even be able to establish a network." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Keep working on it. We'll need every advantage we can get." As the meeting continued, the weight of what they were building became apparent. This was no longer just about surviving day to day. It was about securing a future. Their decisions and precautions would determine whether or not they could hold on to the fragile sanctuary they had created. Each step forward had to be careful and deliberate. The world outside had changed, and now, so had they. But there was no turning back. Noah felt pride as he looked around at their makeshift family. Each person brought something unique to the table. Together they were more than the sum of their parts. As the meeting wrapped up, Noah pulled Charlotte aside. "I need you to come with me on a special mission," he said quietly. "There's something I want to check out." An hour later, the survivors moved silently through the crumbling streets of downtown Chicopee. The sun hung low in the sky, its fading light painting the shattered buildings and debris in hues of orange and red. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the streets were eerily still, as if the city held its breath. Their footsteps were soft against the cracked pavement, each step a reminder that danger was always near, lurking just out of sight. Noah led the group toward a nondescript building. Its once pristine exterior was now covered in layers of grime and dust, and its windows were boarded up and forgotten. The building blended into the desolate landscape like a relic from a time long gone. Charlotte followed closely behind, her grip tight on the crowbar, and her eyes scanning the street for any signs of movement. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice low and cautious, the tension palpable in her every word. Noah allowed a rare smile to break across his face, which seemed almost foreign in a world of fear. "It's an old seed bank," he said, his voice filled with a flicker of hope. "If lucky, we'll find something to help expand our agricultural efforts. Food security could mean the difference between surviving and thriving." Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise as she took in the building. This had the potential to change everything. She nodded, feeling a spark of optimism that she hadn't felt in weeks. But still, the ever-present fear of the undead kept her on edge. Once inside, the group moved swiftly. The air was thick and stale, the darkness wrapping around them like a blanket. Shelves that had once been filled with life-giving resources now lay bare, toppled over by looters and scavengers. But rows of untouched seed packets remained near the back, a gold mine in a world where hope was scarce. Noah and Charlotte worked quickly, stuffing their backpacks with seeds and agricultural guides, their hands moving with practiced precision. Every packet they grabbed felt like a lifeline. They filled their bags with everything from beans to corn, anything that could offer a future for their struggling group back at the Residence Inn. A low groan drifted in from outside as they were zipping their bags closed, the unmistakable sound of zombies. Noah's heart raced as his eyes flicked to the boarded windows. The undead had found them. "Back door," Noah mouthed, motioning for Charlotte to follow. They moved through the building with quiet urgency, their hearts thudding in their chests. The shuffling of feet outside grew louder, the moans of the zombies echoing through the building like a grim chorus. A woman, clearly exhausted and terrified, stood before them. "Please," she gasped, "help me." Noah and Charlotte exchanged a look. This was precisely the kind of situation they had just been discussing. After a moment's hesitation, Noah nodded. "Come with us," he said, "but stay quiet and do exactly as we say." The journey back to the Residence Inn was tense, with several close calls. By the time they reached the gates, word of their new guest had already spread. Frank met them at the entrance, his face a mask of disapproval. "What happened to our screening process?" he demanded. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We couldn't leave her out there to die. She'll go through the same quarantine and evaluation as anyone else." Noah addressed the gathered crowd as the woman was led to the conference center. "I know this isn't what we planned, but sometimes plans change. We're building something here. something important, and part of that is remembering our humanity. Noah held up his backpack, a rare flicker of optimism in his voice. We also brought back seeds, enough to expand our gardens and start thinking about real, sustainable food production. This is how we secure our future, by growing, adapting, and working together. The room fell into a brief silence as everyone processed the gravity of what those seeds represented. They weren't just packets of dried potential. They were hoping for a chance to build something beyond just surviving, a future they could nurture in the harsh soil of this new world. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah, the farmer in their group, immediately set to work with the others, tilling the hard ground and preparing the soil for the new seeds. Together they planted rows of carrots, peas, and potatoes, vegetables that would provide sustenance through the seasons. Tomatoes lined up in the sunniest patch of the garden, their bright red fruits a sign of resilience. Fast-growing beans and zucchini were also added to the mix, their vines curling upward, reaching for the life-giving light. The garden expanded rapidly, and every inch of land around the residence inn is now put to use. Sarah, sweating and smiling through the long days, explained to the others how to cultivate crops in such difficult conditions. The carrots and potatoes can survive the colder weather, but the tomatoes will need to be harvested before the first frost, she said, her voice filled with caution and hope. We'll have to be careful, but if we play our cards right, we can start stockpiling for the winter. Meanwhile, defenses around the inn were strengthened. Frank led a team to fortify the barricades, reinforcing the windows and adding spikes along the perimeter to deter wandering undead. Each day felt like a race against time, but for once, they had a plan that wasn't just about fighting, it was about rebuilding. And then there was Maria, the stranger they had encountered during their mission. It didn't take long for her to prove her worth. Her name had come quietly during one of the rare moments of calm, her hands steady as she cleaned and bandaged one of Frank's wounds from the last skirmish. She had been a nurse before the outbreak, and her medical expertise filled a crucial gap in their group's skill set. Cuts, infections, and injuries, things that could quickly turn fatal without proper care, were now less of a threat with Maria around. In the evenings, she could be found tending to the injured, her presence bringing a sense of calm. People who had hesitated to trust her now looked to her for help, and she offered it willingly. "This is what I can do," Maria had quietly said to Noah one evening. "I couldn't save everyone out there, but I can save the people here. I can make a difference." As the sun set on another day, Noah found himself back on the roof, Charlotte by his side. They watched as members of their community moved about below, each contributing in their own way to their shared survival. "You know," Noah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when all this started, I thought the hardest part would be staying alive, but it's not. It's remembering to live." Charlotte leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. "We're doing more than surviving, Noah. We're building a future." Alex's voice crackled over the newly installed PA system, as if to punctuate her words. "Guys, the radio! I think I've made contact with another group." Noah and Charlotte shared a look of excitement and apprehension. Whatever came next, they would face it together with the strength of the community they had built. As they hurried down to hear the news, Noah felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just securing their future, but shaping it, one day at a time. The zombie apocalypse had changed everything, but it hadn't broken them. In the face of unimaginable horror, they had found strength, compassion, and hope. As long as they held on to those things, Noah knew they could face whatever challenges. The end.